The hidden treasure of Lewis and Clark the night was unusually quiet along the Missouri River. Somewhere beyond the firelight, the great American wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles, dark forests, silent valleys, distant mountains, and rivers that had never appeared on most American maps. It was the summer of 1805. Meriwether Lewis sat beside a small dying campfire, listening to the soft movement of the river. Behind him, William Clark was asleep. The other men of the expedition were quiet inside their blankets, exhausted after another long day of travel. Lewis should have been sleeping too. Instead, he was studying an old piece of leather he had discovered that afternoon. It was not part of their official equipment. It had not belonged to the expedition. And there was something about it that he could not explain. Across the leather was drawn a crude map: a river, 3 mountains, a circle. And beneath the circle, 3 words had been written in faded ink: "What was hidden remains." Lewis slowly turned the leather toward the fire. For a moment the flames illuminated another mark in the corner, a small crescent moon. Lewis had seen that symbol before, not on a map, not in a military document, but on an old silver coin that had been given to him weeks earlier by a trader along the Missouri, a coin that supposedly came from a place no American had ever reached. A place whispered about by fur traders, a place where, according to an old legend, a Spanish expedition had hidden something of enormous value before disappearing into the wilderness. Lewis had never believed the story. At least, he had never believed it completely. But now he wondered. Perhaps the expedition was carrying 2 missions without knowing it. One was written in official documents. The other was waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. And perhaps the strangest part of all was that Lewis was not the only person who knew about the hidden place. Someone else was watching, someone who had been following the expedition silently for days, someone who knew exactly what the crescent moon meant. And before Lewis could understand what he had discovered, a soft sound came from the darkness beyond the trees, a branch breaking. Lewis immediately reached for his pistol. He stared into the darkness. Nothing moved. The river continued its slow journey through the night. Then, for only a second, Lewis saw a figure standing between the trees. A woman. She wore a dark traveling cloak and her face was almost completely hidden beneath the hood. She did not run. She simply looked toward Lewis. Then she disappeared into the forest. Lewis stood motionless beside the fire. He did not know who she was. He did not know what she wanted. And he certainly did not know that before the expedition ended, the mysterious woman and the strange map would become connected to the greatest secret he had ever encountered. Tonight, you are invited to travel quietly with Lewis and Clark into that wilderness. There will be no rushing, no sudden noise, only the gentle sound of water, distant wind, crackling campfires, quiet footsteps, and the mystery of a forgotten treasure waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. So settle comfortably. Let your breathing slow, and as the river moves quietly through the darkness, allow yourself to imagine another America, an America before the railroads, before the great cities spread across the West, an America of enormous forests, endless grasslands, ancient trails, and mountains that seem to touch the stars. This is the story of Lewis and Clark, and the treasure that was never supposed to be found. The journey had begun months earlier. In the spring of 1804, the expedition moved slowly away from St. Louis. The boats carried weapons, food, tools, scientific instruments, trade goods, blankets, medicine, and everything else the men believed they might need. But beyond the last familiar settlements, the world began to change. The roads disappeared. The towns became smaller. Eventually, there were no roads at all. Only the river remained. Lewis often stood at the front of the boat in the early mornings. Mist floated above the water. Birds moved through the pale sky. Sometimes the landscape appeared peaceful enough to make a man forget how dangerous it could become. Clark, meanwhile, spent much of his time recording observations and drawing maps. Every bend in the river mattered. Every mountain mattered. Every unfamiliar trail could become important. They were not simply traveling through empty land. They were moving through places where native nations had lived for generations. The wilderness was not unknown to everyone. It was only unknown to the men who had arrived from the east. That distinction slowly became one of the most important lessons of the expedition. One evening, While the men prepared supper, Lewis noticed an elderly trader sitting alone near the riverbank. The man's name was Samuel Hart. He had spent years traveling between frontier settlements and native communities. Lewis had spoken with him several times before. That evening, however, Hart seemed unusually serious. "You are going farther than most men have gone," Hart said. Lewis smiled. "That is the intention." Hart looked toward the western horizon. "There are places out there that maps have forgot." Lewis laughed quietly. "Then perhaps we should give them names." Hart did not laugh. "Some places are better left unnamed." Lewis looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" The old trader reached inside his coat. From a small cloth pouch he removed a silver coin. He placed it in Lewis's hand. The coin was worn almost smooth. On one side was a faded image of a crowned figure. On the other was the crescent symbol Lewis would later see on the mysterious map. Lewis turned it over. "Where did you get this?" Hart hesitated. "From a man who was dying." "Where?" "Far west." "How far?" Hart looked at the river. "Far enough." Lewis smiled slightly. "You have never been one for precise answers. Precise answers get men killed sometimes." The old trader leaned closer. "There is a story among some of the people of the frontier. Long before your expedition, men traveled north and west searching for wealth. They carried silver, gold, and other things taken from distant places." Lewis studied the coin. "And they never returned. An accident, perhaps. What happened to their treasure?" Hart looked directly into Lewis's eyes. "No one knows." Lewis handed the coin back. "I thought you said you didn't believe in stories." "I don't." Hart closed his fingers around the coin. "I believe people disappear." That night Lewis could not sleep. Not because he believed the legend. At least, that was what he told himself. He simply found the story interesting, nothing more. But the wilderness has a strange way of turning small mysteries into large ones. And several weeks later, the expedition encountered something that made Lewis remember every word. They found an abandoned camp. It was hidden among trees beside a narrow stream. There were no people, no horses, no fresh tracks. Only the remains of a small stone fireplace and several rotting wooden poles. Clark examined the site carefully. "Old," he said. Lewis nodded. "How old?" "Could be years." Clark crouched beside the fireplace. "There is something here." Brushed away the dirt, a piece of metal appeared beneath the soil. It was not a modern American object. Clark lifted it carefully. A small iron clasp. Lewis looked at it. Then he saw the symbol, a crescent. The same crescent from the coin. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Clark asked quietly, "Where do you suppose that came from?" Lewis looked toward the forest. "I don't know." For the first time, the expedition's official mission seemed to overlap with something much older, something hidden, something forgotten, something that perhaps had been waiting for them. The days became colder as they moved farther west. The men traveled along the river beneath enormous skis. At night, the stars seemed brighter than Lewis had ever seen them. There were evenings when the entire camp fell silent except for the water. On one such night, Lewis sat alone beside the fire. He took out the old coin. He had not returned it to Hart. He had kept it not because he believed in treasure, but because he wanted to understand the mystery. He placed the coin beside his journal. Then he heard footsteps. Lewis turned. It was Clark. "You're awake again." "So are you?" Clark smiled. "I heard you talking to yourself." "I was thinking." "That's usually what people call it." Lewis laughed softly. Clark sat beside him. For a while neither spoke. The two men watched sparks rise into the darkness. Then Clark noticed the coin. "Where did you get that?" Lewis explained. Clark listened carefully. When the story was finished, he shook his head. "You know what happens when men hear the word treasure? They become interested. They become foolish." Lewis smiled. "Perhaps." Clark looked into the fire. "Gold has ruined more journeys than storms ever have." Lewis put the coin away. "I am not searching for gold." "Good." A long silence followed. Then Clark said, "Because I would rather find a safe trail through the mountains." Lewis nodded. "Would I?" Neither man knew that the mountains ahead would offer them something, neither safety nor gold. They would offer a choice. And somewhere in those mountains, another traveler was moving through the night. The mysterious woman, she had been watching them for days. Her name was Eleanor Vale. She was not part of the expedition. She had no official reason to be there. Yet she knew the wilderness better than Lewis expected any solitary traveler could. Her father had once traveled west with a group of traders. He had never returned. Before his disappearance, he had left behind a journal containing a strange drawing, a crescent moon, 3 mountains, and the same words, "What was hidden remains." Alina had spent years trying to understand what happened to him. She had followed old trails, spoken to traders, listened to stories around distant fires. And eventually she learned that Lewis and Clark were traveling west. The expedition carried maps, supplies, military protection, and something else, knowledge. Alina believed that if the secret of her father's disappearance was still alive, Lewis and Clark might unknowingly lead her directly to it. She did not trust them, not yet. But she did not fear them either. What she feared was the wilderness itself. Because the deeper she traveled, the more she began to understand something her father had once written. The greatest treasures are rarely guarded by walls. Sometimes they are guarded by distance, sometimes by silence, and sometimes by people who do not want to be found. Several days later, Alina watched the expedition from a distant ridge. Below her, the boats moved slowly along the river. Smoke rose from the camp. Men walked between the tents. Horses grazed nearby. She recognized Lewis immediately. She had seen him from a distance before, but there was something different about him tonight. He was standing alone near the river, looking west, almost as if he could feel that someone was watching him. Alina stepped backward into the trees. A twig snapped beneath her boot. Lewis turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Alina knew she should disappear. Instead, she remained there. Lewis took one cautious step forward. "Who are you?" Alina said nothing. "Are you lost?" "No." "Then why are you following us?" she finally answered. "I am looking for something." Stared at her. "What?" Alina's eyes moved toward the mountains. "A place." "Place? The place where my father disappeared." Lewis remained silent. Then Alina added, "And I believe you have something that belongs to him." Lewis's hand slowly moved toward his coat, the silver coin. Alina saw the movement. Her expression changed. "You have it." Lewis looked at the coin, then back at her. "How do you know?" "Because I have been looking for that symbol for 7 years." Wind moved through the trees. The river continued flowing below them. And somewhere far away, a wolf called into the night. Lewis realized that the story was becoming much larger than he had imagined. He stepped closer. "What was your father's name?" Alina looked at him. "Thomas Vale." Lewis's expression changed. He had heard the name, not recently, but in an old report, a trader, a missing expedition. A man who had supposedly vanished somewhere beyond the Western Territories. Lewis slowly removed the coin from his coat. "I was given this by a trader." Alina shook her head. "No." She stepped closer. "He didn't give it to you." Lewis frowned. "What do you mean?" "My father left too." She reached beneath her cloak and produced another silver coin. It was almost identical. Lewis stared at it. 2 coins, 2 symbols, 1 mystery. For several moments the forest seemed completely silent. Then Alina whispered, "There is something hidden beyond the mountains." Lewis looked at the distant peaks. "What?" "I don't know. You came all this way without knowing." "I came because my father believed it was there." "You believe him?" Alina looked down at the coin in her hand. "I believe he had a reason to disappear." Lewis studied her face. There was sadness there, but also determination. And beneath that determination, something softer, something Lewis could not quite identify. Perhaps it was trust waiting to be earned. Perhaps it was loneliness. Perhaps it was simply the strange feeling of meeting another person who had spent years following the same unanswered question. The firelight from the expedition's camp flickered through the trees. Alina stepped backward. "You should forget the treasure." "Why?" "Because someone else is looking for it." Hesitated, then she said, "The people who killed my father." Lewis's face became serious. "Are they still alive?" Alina looked toward the dark mountains. "I don't know." She turned to leave. Lewis called after her. "Alina," she stopped. "If you know where the trail begins, show me." She looked back. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then help me understand." For the first time, a faint smile appeared on her face. "Perhaps I will." Then she disappeared into the trees. Lewis remained standing there. He looked at the silver coin in his hand, then toward the mountains. The official expedition was moving west. But now, hidden beneath its scientific mission and political purpose, another journey had begun. A journey toward a forgotten camp, a lost man, a mysterious woman, and a treasure whose true value neither Lewis nor Clark yet understood. That night, Lewis finally returned to his tent. Clark was still awake. He looked up. "You've been gone a while." Lewis sat down. "I met someone." Raised an eyebrow. "Someone?" "A woman." Clark smiled. That explains the mysterious expression. Lewis ignored him. She says her father disappeared in the mountains. Clark's smile faded. The coin? Lewis placed it on the table. Clark stared at it, then he looked at Lewis. I thought you weren't searching for treasure. Lewis looked toward the darkness outside. I don't think we are, he paused. I think the treasure may be searching for us. Outside the tent, beneath a sky filled with cold stars, the river continued carrying the expedition west, toward mountains no map could fully explain, toward secrets buried beneath stone and snow, and toward a hidden place where, long ago, someone had left behind something worth risking everything to find. The journey had only just begun. The next morning arrived quietly. A thin layer of mist rested above the Missouri River, and the first light of dawn slowly touched the tops of the trees. Lewis had barely slept. The mysterious meeting with Alina remained in his thoughts. He kept remembering her final words, the people who killed my father. There was something in her voice that made him believe she was telling the truth. But there was also something she had not told him, something she was still hiding. Across the camp, the expedition was already beginning its morning routine. Horses were being prepared, cooking fires were being lit, men gathered their equipment. Clark stood beside the river, studying the current. Lewis walked toward him. You're quiet this morning, Clark said. Are you? I've been thinking. About Alina. Clark smiled slightly. About the mountains. Lewis looked west. The distant peaks were still hidden behind morning haze. We'll reach them soon, Clark said. Lewis nodded. Neither man noticed the small figure watching them from the forest. Alina had returned. She stood among the trees, carrying a leather satchel against her side. She watched the expedition prepare to leave. Then she noticed something that made her expression change. A rider, far across the valley. A single horseman was moving slowly along a distant ridge. Alina immediately recognized him. She had seen him 3 nights earlier, and before that twice along the trail. The man was following them. She tightened her grip around the leather satchel. Her father had once written about a man like him, a man who never traveled with a large group, a man who appeared wherever the old treasure stories appeared. Alina turned toward the expedition. She knew she had to warn Lewis. But before she could step from the trees, a hand suddenly covered her mouth. She froze. A voice whispered beside her, "Move." Alina's heart began to race. She slowly looked sideways. It was not an enemy. It was Lewis. He released her and stepped back. I saw you watching us. Alina turned sharply. You followed me. I followed your tracks. She looked toward the distant ridge. Do you see that rider? Lewis nodded. Don't let him know that you saw him. Who is he? I don't know. Lewis looked at her. You're lying. Alina stared at him. After a moment, she quietly said, I've seen him before. Where? Near my father's last camp. Lewis became still. Then we need to talk. Alina nodded. They moved deeper into the forest, away from the camp. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Alina opened her leather satchel. Inside was an old journal. The pages were yellow and fragile. She handed it to Lewis. My father's journal. Lewis carefully opened it. Most of the writing was difficult to read, but several pages contained drawings, mountains, a river, a narrow canyon, and the crescent symbol. Lewis turned another page. There, written in his father's hand, were several words. When the river bends beneath the 3 silent peaks, look for the stone that faces the moon. Lewis read the sentence twice. What does it mean? Alina shook her head. I don't know. You followed this clue for 7 years. I found the river. And I found the mountains. Lewis looked at the drawing. But you never found the stone. No, why? Alina hesitated. Because my father wasn't alone when he came here. Looked up. Who was with him? A group of men. Many 6. None returned. Only one. Who? Alina closed the journal. The man on the ridge. A cold silence passed between them. Lewis slowly looked toward the distant mountains. The treasure suddenly seemed less important. The danger was becoming real. Yet something else had changed too. He trusted Alina. He wasn't sure when it had happened. Perhaps it was the way she spoke about her father. Perhaps it was the quiet sadness in her eyes. Or perhaps it was simply because in this enormous wilderness, 2 people searching for answers had somehow found each other. Alina noticed Lewis staring at her. What? Nothing. She smiled faintly. You're a terrible liar. So I've been told. For the first time, they both laughed. It was a small moment, almost nothing. But in the middle of a dangerous wilderness, small moments mattered. A gentle wind moved through the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a bird called softly. For a few seconds, the mystery disappeared. There was only the forest, the morning light, and two travelers standing quietly beneath the trees. Then a gunshot echoed from the distant ridge. The moment vanished. Lewis immediately reached for his weapon. Alina grabbed his arm. "Don't." Shots sounded. The rider had disappeared. Lewis looked at her. "What was that?" Alina whispered. "He knows we're here." Somewhere beyond the trees, hidden beneath the enormous western sky, the first real danger of their journey had begun. For several moments, neither Lewis nor Alina moved. The echo of the gunshot slowly disappeared into the mountains. Then the wilderness became quiet again. Almost too quiet. Lewis looked toward the ridge. "We should return to camp." Alina shook her head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because if he is watching the camp, he'll expect us to go there." I studied her carefully. "You've been running from this man for a long time." "Yes." "Then you know him." "No, but you recognize him." Alina lowered her eyes. "I recognize the way he moves." Lewis waited. She finally whispered, "My father described him in his journal." Lewis opened the old book again. "Where?" Alina turned several pages. Near the back was a short entry. The handwriting was hurried, almost frightened. Lewis read silently. "There is a man among us who knows about the stone. He says he wants the treasure. But I believe he wants something more. He does not care what happens to the others." Lewis looked at Alina. "What happened next?" She shook her head. "That was the last page." A cold wind passed between them. Lewis closed the journal. "Then we need to find the stone before he does." Alina looked surprised. "You still want to continue?" Lewis smiled faintly. "I've crossed half a continent." Looked toward the mountains. "I don't intend to turn around because someone fired a shot." For the first time, Alina seemed almost amused. "You are stubborn." "So I've been told." "Reckless." "Probably." She smiled. Then she quietly said, "Thank you." Lewis looked at her. "For what?" "For believing me." Before he could answer, voices came from the direction of the camp. Clark was calling his name. Lewis and Alina quickly returned. Clark was standing beside the boats. His expression was serious. "We have a problem." Lewis looked at him. "What happened?" Clark pointed toward the riverbank. One of the expedition's horses was missing. Its tracks led west, toward the mountains. Lewis immediately understood. Someone had taken it, but there was something stranger. Beside the hoofprints were human footprints, fresh ones. Clark crouched down. "Whoever took the horse didn't want us to notice." Alina examined the ground. "He wants us to follow." Looked at her. "You're Alina." She nodded. Clark glanced at Lewis. "You've been busy." Lewis ignored the remark. "What do you think?" Clark studied the tracks again. "I think someone wants us away from the river." Alina slowly opened her father's journal. "There may be a reason." She showed them the drawing. 3 mountains, a river bending around them, and a small stone marked beneath a crescent moon. Clark stared at it. "That's not far from here." Lewis looked at him. "You recognize it?" "I saw those mountains yesterday." Alina's eyes widened. "Then we're close." Expedition continued west. But now the journey felt different. Every bend in the river seemed to hide something. Every distant rider could have been the mysterious man. Every unfamiliar trail might lead toward the stone. That evening they made camp beneath a group of tall trees. The fire burned softly. The men spoke quietly. Most of them knew nothing about the treasure. Lewis had decided that was safer. Only Clark and Alina knew the truth. Later, when the camp became silent, Lewis sat beside the fire. Alina sat several feet away. The flames reflected softly in her eyes. "You should sleep," Lewis said. "Should you?" "I'll sleep later," she smiled. "You always say that." "How would you know?" "I've been watching you." Lewis looked at her for a moment. Neither spoke. Then Alina said, "When this is over, what will you do?" Lewis thought about the question. "Go home, perhaps." "If you find the treasure, I don't know." "If it changes everything," Lewis looked into the fire. "Maybe some things are better left unchanged." Alina nodded. "I think my father believed that." Fire cracked softly. Above them, the stars appeared one by one. Lewis looked at Alina. "What do you want?" She was silent for a long time. "An answer. To your father's disappearance. To everything." Voice became quieter. "I want to know why he left." Lewis understood. Sometimes people search for treasure when what they truly wanted was closure. The gold was only an excuse. The real treasure was an answer. Suddenly, a soft rustling came from the darkness. Lewis stood. Alina reached for her weapon, but no one appeared, only the wind. Then Lewis noticed something near the edge of the firelight. A small object had been placed on a rock. He walked toward it. It was a silver coin, the same crescent symbol. But this time there was a message carved into the metal. Lewis held it toward the fire. 3 words, "Follow the moon." Alina stared at it, then she whispered, "He knows." Lewis looked toward the dark forest. "Who?" Alina's face had gone pale. "The man who followed my father." Somewhere beyond the trees, a horse slowly moved through the darkness. Someone was waiting. Watching and waiting for Lewis and Alina to begin following the moon. The moon was rising above the trees. Its pale light spread across the wilderness, turning the river into a long silver ribbon. Lewis stood beside the fire, holding the strange coin. Follow the moon. The words were still fresh. Someone had carved them recently. Alina looked toward the forest. We should leave. Lewis nodded. Now, before dawn, Clark approached quietly. I heard enough. Lewis looked at him. You were listening. I've learned that when you and a mysterious woman disappear into the forest, I should probably pay attention. Almost smiled, Clark examined the coin. This symbol again. Turned it over, nothing. Then Alina noticed something. Hold it toward the moon. Lewis raised the coin. The silver surface caught the moonlight. A faint line appeared across the metal. It formed the shape of a river. And beside it were 3 tiny marks, 3 mountains. Clark whispered, "It is a map." Lewis looked at Alina. Your father knew this place. He did. Then he must have left another clue. Alina opened the journal. She slowly turned the pages. Nothing. Then she remembered something. Father used to write in invisible ink. Lewis looked surprised. With what? Lemon juice. Clark smiled. That is an old trick. Alina held a page near the fire. Slowly, faint brown letters appeared. Lewis leaned closer. A sentence emerged. When the moon stands above the middle peak, leave the river and follow the silent path. Below it was another drawing. A narrow trail, 3 trees, a stone shaped like an arrow. And beneath that, one final sentence, trust the person who walks beside you. Alina read it twice. Then she looked at Lewis. Neither spoke. The words seemed strangely personal. Perhaps her father had simply meant a companion. Perhaps he had known that one day Alina would follow the trail. Or perhaps he had understood something deeper about the journey. Lewis folded the page carefully. We'll go tomorrow. Alina nodded. But before they could say anything else, a sound came from the river, a splash, then another. Someone was crossing the water. Lewis extinguished the fire. The camp fell into darkness. The men reached for their weapons. Everyone remained silent. Across the river, a shadow moved between the trees. Then a voice called softly, Lewis. Lewis froze. The voice was familiar. It was Samuel Hart, the old trader who had given him the first coin. Lewis stepped toward the river. Hart. No answer. Then the voice came again. Not follow the moon. Alina looked at Lewis. Old trader finally appeared on the opposite bank. He looked exhausted. His clothes were wet. There was blood on his sleeve. Clark whispered, he's been wounded. Hart raised one hand. You don't understand. Lewis shouted across the river. Who did this? Hart looked behind him. They are coming. Men who have been searching for the treasure. Alina stepped forward. My father's killer. Hart looked directly at her. Yes. Alina's face changed. Who is he? Hart hesitated. Then he said a name. Thomas Vale. Went completely still. Lewis stared at him. That is her father. Hart shook his head. No. Looked toward Alina. Your father was not killed. The forest seemed to disappear into silence. Alina could barely breathe. What did you say? Hart's voice softened. Your father is alive. For 7 years, Alina had believed that Thomas Vale was dead. 7 years of searching. 7 years of grief. And now, in the middle of the wilderness, an old trader had told her the impossible. Her father was alive. Alina took one step toward the river. Where is he? Hart looked toward the mountains. He is waiting for you. Where? At the place where the treasure was hidden. Lewis felt a strange chill. The mystery had suddenly become something much more dangerous. If Thomas Vale was alive, why had he never returned? Why had he allowed his daughter to believe he was dead? And what exactly had he discovered in the mountains? Hart looked at Lewis. You must understand something. What? The treasure is not gold. Lewis stared at him. Then what is it? Hart looked toward the moon. The reason men disappeared. Lewis could ask another question. A distant gunshot echoed through the valley. Hart fell to his knees. The men rushed toward the river, but the old trader was already gone. Only ripples remained on the dark water. Alina stood motionless. Lewis stepped beside her. Are you all right? She shook her head. Father is alive. He's waiting for me. Lewis looked toward the mountains. Then we'll find him. Alina turned toward Lewis. You don't have to come. I know. Then why are you? Lewis smiled gently. Because you shouldn't have to walk into the unknown alone. For a moment, Alina simply looked at him. Then she reached for his hand. Her fingers touched his. Neither of them spoke. Above them, the moon continued its slow journey across the sky. And far beyond the river, 3 dark mountains waited beneath its light. Somewhere among those mountains was Thomas Vale, somewhere was the hidden treasure. And somewhere in the darkness, the men searching for both were already moving closer. The expedition would leave before sunrise. And this time they would not follow the river. They would follow the moon. Before sunrise, the expedition quietly broke camp. The river was still covered in mist. The men packed their supplies while the horses stood patiently beneath the trees. Lewis looked toward the mountains. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, the river was no longer their guide. The trail ahead disappeared into thick forest. Alina stood beside him. "You're certain?" Lewis nodded. "No," she smiled faintly. "At least you're honest." Approached with a map. "I found the trail," pointed toward a narrow opening between two hills. "It follows an old native trail. Someone has used it recently." Alina examined the ground. There. A footprint, then another, small but fresh. Lewis looked at her. "Father, perhaps." They began walking. The forest slowly became thicker. Branches crossed above them, blocking the morning sunlight. Birds called from hidden places. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and distant rain. For hours they climbed. The men became quieter as the trail grew steeper. Eventually they reached a narrow ridge. Below them the river appeared as a thin silver line. Alina stopped. She looked back. "On farther than my father ever described." Lewis looked ahead. "Then perhaps we're close." They continued. Near midday they found the first sign. 3 enormous trees stood together, exactly as shown in the journal. Beneath them was a stone shaped like an arrow. Alina knelt beside it. Her hands trembled. "This is it." Lewis brushed away the leaves. Under the stone was a small metal box. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Alina opened it. Her father's handwriting. "If you have found this, then you have followed the moon. The treasure is not beneath the mountains. It is within them." Alina looked confused. "What does that mean?" Clark studied the map. "There must be a cave." Lewis looked around, then he noticed something. A narrow opening between 2 rocks. Cold air flowed from inside. Alina approached it slowly. "My father was here." Lewis nodded. They entered. The cave was dark. Their lanterns illuminated walls covered with strange markings. Some were native symbols, others appeared European. And among them was the familiar crescent moon. The deeper they walked, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, only the sound of their footsteps. Then Alina stopped. Ahead was a wooden door. It was old, but still intact. Across it were carved 3 words. "What was hidden?" Lewis pushed gently. The door opened. Inside was a small chamber. There were no mountains of gold, no jewels, no treasure chests. Instead, the room contained shelves, books, maps, journals, letters, and dozens of objects from different parts of the world. Clark stared in amazement. "This isn't a treasure." Lewis slowly stepped forward. "It is a record." Alina picked up an old journal. Her father's name was written on the cover. She opened it. The first page contained only one sentence. "If my daughter ever finds this place, she must know the truth." Alina's hands began to shake. She turned the page, and there it was, the truth about her father's disappearance. He had not been searching for gold. He had discovered something much more valuable. A hidden collection of maps and journals documenting ancient routes across the American wilderness, routes known to native peoples long before European explorers arrived. But someone wanted those records. A group of men believed they could use the maps to locate valuable land, minerals, and hidden trading routes. Thomas Vale had refused to help them, so they had hunted him. He had disappeared into the mountains and hidden the records here. Then he had stayed away to protect his daughter. Alina closed her eyes. "He was alive all this time." Lewis stood beside her. "He was protecting you." She looked at him. Tears appeared in her eyes. "I hated him for leaving." Lewis spoke softly. "People leave because they love someone too much to bring them into danger." Wiped her eyes. For a moment the mystery seemed to have ended. But then a sound came from outside the chamber. Footsteps, slow, heavy. Someone was entering the cave. Clark extinguished the lantern. Everyone became silent. A shadow appeared beyond the doorway, then another. Alina whispered, "They found us." Lewis reached for his weapon. But before anyone could move, a familiar voice echoed through the darkness. "Alina." She froze. The voice was older, tired, but unmistakably familiar. Her father, Thomas Vale. Alina stepped toward the doorway. "Father." A man emerged from the darkness. His hair was gray, his face was thin, but his eyes were the same. Alina could not speak. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I knew you would find me." She ran toward him. For 7 years she had imagined this moment. But no dream had prepared her for it. She embraced him. Thomas closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither spoke. Lewis and Clark stood quietly nearby. Outside, the wind moved through the mountain trees. The treasure had been found, but the greatest discovery was not gold. It was a family reunited after 7 years of silence. Thomas eventually looked toward Lewis. "You came farther than I expected." Lewis smiled. "And you left quite a trail." Laughed softly, then his expression became serious. "Unfortunately, we have very little time." Lewis looked toward the cave entrance. "The men?" Thomas nodded. "They know where the chamber is." A distant sound echoed through the tunnel. Someone was approaching. Thomas looked at his daughter. "Now you must decide what to do with the treasure." Eleanor looked around at the books, maps, and journals. Then she looked at Lewis, and for the first time she understood. The treasure was never meant to belong to one person. It was meant to preserve the stories of people who had been here long before them. Lewis quietly closed the old journal. Outside the cave, footsteps grew louder. The final secret was about to be revealed. The footsteps grew louder, one step, then another. The sound echoed through the stone passage. Thomas quickly moved toward the entrance. "There's another way out," he whispered. Lewis looked at him. "Where?" Thomas pointed toward the back of the chamber. Behind a stack of old wooden boxes was a narrow opening. "It leads to the other side of the mountain." Clark immediately began moving the boxes. Eleanor remained beside her father. "You stayed here all these years." Thomas nodded. "I had no choice." "Why didn't you come home?" Thomas looked at her. "Because the men searching for this place were watching everyone connected to me." "You could have sent a message." "I tried." Eleanor's expression changed. "I never received one." Lowered his eyes. "Because they found the messenger." Silence filled the chamber. Lewis understood that there were still pieces of the story Eleanor did not know. Before he could ask, a voice echoed from the entrance. "Thomas." Thomas froze. He knew the voice. The man had finally arrived. Thomas whispered, "Go." Lewis looked at him. "Not leaving you." "You don't understand." Looked toward the cave entrance. "He has killed before." Voice followed. "You cannot hide forever." Eleanor stepped forward. "Who is he?" Thomas looked at her. "His name is Richard Blackwood." Lewis recognized the name immediately. A wealthy trader, a man who had traveled throughout the Western Territories, a man rumored to have funded several private expeditions. Thomas had once worked with him, until he discovered what Blackwood really wanted: not knowledge, not exploration, land, power, and wealth. Blackwood believed the old maps could lead him to places rich in valuable resources. He wanted to control those routes before anyone else knew about them. Thomas had refused, so Blackwood had hunted him for years. The footsteps reached the chamber. Then a man's voice spoke calmly. "Thomas, you know there is nowhere left to run." Lewis raised his pistol. Thomas shook his head. "No," pointed toward the hidden passage. "Take Eleanor." She refused. "No, please." Her father's voice softened. "You've spent 7 years looking for me." Smiled sadly. "Now I want you to live." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Lewis gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll come back." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because we have a journey to finish." For a moment, Eleanor did not move. Then she nodded. Clark led them toward the passage. Lewis stayed behind for one final moment. Thomas looked at him. "Protect her." Lewis nodded. "I will," smiled. "Then perhaps my daughter chose the right person to follow." Lewis looked toward Eleanor. She was waiting. He followed her into the darkness. Behind them, the wooden door opened. Richard Blackwood entered the chamber. Thomas stood alone beside the treasure. Blackwood smiled. At last. Looked at him. "You still don't understand." "What?" "The treasure was never mine." Blackwood laughed. "Everything has a price." Shook his head. "Not everything." Then he reached for the lantern and blew it out. The chamber disappeared into darkness. Meanwhile, Lewis, Eleanor, and Clark moved through the narrow passage. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person. Cold water dripped from the ceiling. Their footsteps echoed softly. Eleanor held her father's journal against her chest. Lewis walked behind her. After several minutes, she stopped. "Lewis." "Yes, if we escape." She hesitated. What happens to us?" Lewis looked at her. "I don't know." She turned toward him. "I don't want to lose you." The words were almost a whisper. Lewis remained silent. Then he gently took her hand. "You won't." They stood there in the darkness. No treasure, no maps, no danger. Just two people who had discovered that somewhere between the river and the mountains they had begun to care for one another. Then Clark cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt." Eleanor laughed quietly. Lewis smiled. "Keep moving." They continued through the passage. Eventually, a faint light appeared ahead. The exit. They stepped outside. Morning sunlight filled the valley. For the first time in hours, Alina could breathe freely. She looked back toward the mountain. Her father was still inside, but she believed he would survive. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from the cave, then silence. Alina looked at Lewis. "We have to go back." Lewis nodded. They turned toward the mountain. But before they could move, a figure appeared on the ridge. Thomas. He was alive, and behind him the cave entrance had been sealed by falling stone. Thomas raised one hand. Then he pointed toward the west, far beyond the mountains. A new trail waited. The final destination of the expedition was still ahead. And Thomas had one last secret to reveal. The treasure they had discovered was only the beginning. Thomas slowly walked down from the ridge. Alina ran toward him. For the second time that morning, she embraced her father. This time, Thomas held her tightly. "I thought I lost you again," she whispered. "You didn't." Lewis and Clark approached. Thomas looked at the two men. "You need to leave this valley." Lewis frowned. "Why?" "Because Blackwood isn't alone." Look toward the mountains. "How many?" "Enough." Thomas pointed west. "There is another trail. It leads to a valley beyond these mountains." Lewis unfolded his map. "Why go there?" Thomas hesitated. "That is where the real secret is." Alina looked at him. "You said the treasure was here. The records were here." Looked toward the sealed cave. "But the reason those records were created is somewhere else." Lewis studied the map. "What is in the valley?" Thomas answered quietly. "An old settlement." "Whose?" "No one knows." They began walking. The trail was narrow and covered with fallen leaves. Thomas moved slowly, but he knew every turn. As the sun climbed higher, the trees gradually became thinner. Then the mountains opened. Beyond them was a hidden valley. Alina stopped. She stared. At the center of the valley stood the remains of stone buildings, old walls, broken towers, a road disappearing beneath the grass. Lewis slowly lowered his map. "This isn't on any map," smiled. "That is why it remained hidden." They entered the valley carefully. The place was silent. No birds, no people, only the wind moving through broken stone. Clark examined the buildings. "These are old." "Old," Thomas replied. Lewis noticed symbols carved into the walls. The crescent moon appeared again. But beneath it was another symbol, a circle surrounded by 3 lines. Alina opened her father's journal. The same symbol was drawn on the final page. Thomas looked at it. "Father found this place before me." Lewis looked surprised. "Your grandfather?" Thomas nodded. He believed the settlement was created by travelers who crossed the continent long before modern explorers. Clark looked at the ruins. "Where did they come from?" Thomas shook his head. "That is the mystery." They continued deeper into the valley. Eventually, they reached a stone building that was still mostly intact. Inside was a long table. On the table were several wooden boxes. Thomas opened one. Inside were small pieces of gold. Alina stared. "There was treasure." Nodded. "Some." Lewis looked at the gold. "You said the treasure wasn't gold." "It isn't." Closed the box. "The gold was simply payment." "For what?" Thomas pointed toward the far wall. There was a massive stone map carved into it. Lewis stepped closer. The map showed rivers, mountains, forests, and trails, but it also showed something else, a route stretching across the entire continent. Clark stared in disbelief. "This is impossible," shook his head. "It was made centuries ago." Lewis traced the route with his finger. "This connects the rivers." "Yes." "The mountains." "Yes." "The western coast." Thomas nodded. Lewis looked at Alina. "This is the greatest map we've ever seen." Alina smiled. Her father's treasure was not gold, it was knowledge. Knowledge of a continent that had been mapped by people whose names history had forgotten. And now Lewis and Clark stood before it, but Thomas suddenly became serious. "There is one more thing," pointed to the western end of the map. A small mark had been carved there, a crescent moon. Beside it were 4 words, "The journey continues west." Lewis stared at the inscription. Clark slowly smiled. "Even after all this, we still have somewhere to go," Lewis said. Alina looked at him. "Would you really continue?" Lewis looked toward the distant horizon. She smiled. "Then I'll come with you." Lewis looked back at her. "I was hoping you would." For a moment the valley felt peaceful. The mystery had brought them together. The treasure had revealed a forgotten history. And the journey had become something more than an expedition. But far behind them on the mountain ridge, a man was watching. Richard Blackwood had survived, and he had seen the map. He now knew where Lewis and Clark were going, toward the western coast, toward the final secret, and this time he would follow them. The journey was not over, it was only becoming more dangerous. The expedition left the hidden valley the following morning. The air was cold, but the sky was clear. For the first time in many days, Lewis felt strangely peaceful. The mystery of the treasure had changed. It was no longer about gold. It was about the forgotten people who had crossed these lands before them, the maps, the journals, the ancient trails, and the stories that had survived without ever being written into American history. Alina rode beside Lewis. Her father traveled with Clark and the others farther ahead. For several miles they said very little. The mountains slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead was another immense wilderness. Alina finally broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met?" Lewis smiled. "Probably fewer mysteries," she laughed softly. "And perhaps less trouble. Definitely less trouble." She looked at him. "But would you change it?" Lewis thought for a moment. "No." Alina lowered her eyes. "Neither would I." The trail continued west. That evening they stopped beside a quiet stream. The men built a small fire. The sound of water flowing over stones filled the night. Alina sat beside Lewis. The stars were unusually bright. "Father once told me," she said, "that the wilderness remembers everything." Lewis looked at the dark trees. "Do you believe that?" "I do now." She reached into her satchel and removed the old journal. She opened the final page. There was a sentence she had never noticed before. "When you reach the Western Sea, look beneath the evening star." Lewis read it carefully. The Western Sea. Alina nodded. "Father never reached it." "Perhaps you will," she smiled. "Perhaps we will." A gentle silence followed. Lewis looked at her. "You know, when this journey began, I expected to discover plants, animals, rivers, and mountains. Instead," he looked at Alina. "I discovered a mystery." She smiled. And he hesitated. "You?" Alina looked away, hiding a smile. The fire crackled softly for a moment. The wilderness seemed almost peaceful. Then Clark appeared. "We have visitors." Lewis stood immediately. "Who?" Clark pointed toward the ridge. A distant figure stood beneath the trees, then another. Then another. Lewis reached for his weapon. Alina's expression changed. Approached, he looked toward the ridge. "They followed us." Clark counted the figures, at least 8. Lewis looked around. There was no easy escape. The river was behind them. The forest was thick. The mountains were several miles away. Thomas quietly said, "They want the map." Lewis shook his head. "They'll never get it." Alina looked at him. "What do we do?" Lewis stared into the darkness. Then he remembered something from the ancient map. A narrow trail, a forgotten route beside the river. He pointed toward the trees. "There." Clark looked. "Are you sure?" "No," he smiled. "It's worth trying." The expedition quickly gathered its supplies. The horses were moved quietly. The campfire was left burning. Then they disappeared into the forest. Minutes later, Blackwood entered the abandoned camp. He saw the fire, the empty blankets, the tracks. He smiled. "They're afraid." One of his men pointed toward the river. "They went that way." Blackwood shook his head. "No." He looked at the mountains. "They are following the old route." Had seen the map too, and he knew exactly where it led. The Western Sea. Smiled. "Them go." His men looked confused. Blackwood mounted his horse. "We'll meet them there." Ahead, Lewis and the others moved silently through the forest. The moon rose above the trees. Alina rode beside Lewis. She looked at the sky. "You think we'll find the final treasure?" Lewis smiled. "I think we've already found it." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward her. "The journey is worth more than what waits at the end." Alina smiled. And beneath the quiet moon, they continued west. Neither of them knew that the greatest danger of the expedition was still ahead. And neither knew that at the edge of the Western Sea, an ancient secret was waiting beneath the evening star. The journey west continued beneath an endless sky. For several days, the expedition followed the hidden trail shown on the ancient map. The path was narrow and sometimes almost impossible to see, but Thomas remembered enough of the old markings to guide them. Each evening, when the sun disappeared, the mountains became dark silhouettes against the fading light. And each night, Lewis looked toward the western sky. He was searching for the evening star. Alina noticed. "You're looking for it again." Lewis smiled. "Your father's final clue." She looked upward. "One day we'll find it." "I believe we will." They continued. The landscape slowly changed. The forests became taller. The air became colder. Rain arrived more frequently. Then, one morning, they heard something they had never heard before. A distant roar. At first, Lewis thought it was thunder, but Thomas stopped his horse. "No," listened carefully. "That is the ocean." Became quiet. After months of rivers, forests, and mountains, the sound of the Pacific was finally approaching. The expedition moved forward. By afternoon, the trees opened. Beyond them was an enormous gray horizon, the Pacific Ocean. The men stopped. Some simply stared, others smiled. Clark removed his hat. Lewis stood quietly. For a few moments, nobody spoke. They had crossed the continent, but Alina was looking somewhere else, toward the sky. The evening star had appeared. She opened her father's journal. The final page contained one last drawing, a small cave beside the ocean. Above it, the evening star. Thomas looked at the shoreline. I know that place. They followed the beach. The tide moved gently across the sand. The evening light became softer. Finally, they reached a rocky cliff. At its base was a narrow opening. Lewis entered first. Inside, the cave was small. There was no gold, no treasure chest, only a wooden box. Alina approached it slowly. Her hands trembled. She opened the lid. Inside was a letter. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately. Father's. Alina unfolded the paper. She began reading. To whoever finds this place. If you have reached the Western Sea, then you have traveled farther than I ever imagined. The treasure was never intended to make anyone rich. It was meant to preserve memory. The people who crossed these lands before us knew the rivers, mountains, seasons, and paths better than any mapmaker. Their knowledge belongs to no single person. If you have found these records, carry them forward. Alina stopped reading. Tears filled her eyes. At the bottom of the letter was another sentence. And if my daughter ever comes here, tell her I never forgot her. Alina covered her face. Thomas stepped forward. I wrote that before I disappeared. She looked at him. You knew I would come. I hoped. They embraced. Lewis quietly stepped outside. He stood on the beach and listened to the ocean. The waves moved gently against the shore. For the first time, there was no mystery, no enemy, no hidden trail, only the sea. Alina eventually joined him. Thank you. Lewis looked at her. For what? For staying. He smiled. I told you I wouldn't leave. She looked toward the horizon. What happens now? Lewis watched the evening star. Now we go home. Alina smiled. And the treasure? Lewis looked back toward the cave. The treasure comes with us. The gold, not the ancient coins, but the stories, the maps, the knowledge, and the memory of everyone who had traveled those forgotten paths. Far behind them, the wilderness was already becoming quiet again. The mountains stood beneath the fading light. The rivers continued toward the sea, and the ancient trails disappeared beneath grass and forest. But some journeys never truly end. They remain in the stories people tell, in maps drawn by tired hands, in journals written beside lonely campfires, and in the memories of those who dared to walk into the unknown. Lewis looked at Alina. She smiled. Then they walked slowly along the beach together. The waves rolled softly beside them. The evening star shone above. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the last light of day disappeared into the Pacific. For a moment, the entire world seemed peaceful. And perhaps that was the greatest treasure of all. The days beside the Pacific passed quietly. After so many months of difficult travel, the ocean seemed almost unreal. The expedition built a small camp near the shore. At night, the men listened to the waves. The sound was different from the Missouri River. The ocean was larger, deeper, and more mysterious. Lewis often walked along the beach after sunset. Sometimes Alina joined him. They rarely spoke. They didn't need to. The long journey had changed them. One evening, Alina found Lewis sitting beside a small fire. She sat beside him. Thinking again, Lewis smiled. I suppose I am. About going home. Yes, she looked toward the ocean. Never had a home to return to. Lewis looked at her. You have one now. She turned toward him. Wherever you decide to stay. Alina smiled. The fire crackled between them. For a while they listened to the waves. Then she placed her hand gently over his. I think I know where. Lewis looked at her. Neither spoke. Above them, the stars slowly appeared. The mystery that had brought them together was finally over. But something else had begun, a quiet affection, a friendship that had grown into something deeper, something neither had expected when they first met beneath the trees beside the Missouri. The following morning, Thomas brought Lewis a small wooden box. Inside was one of the ancient coins. The crescent symbol was still visible. Take it, Thomas said. Lewis shook his head. It belongs to your family. Smiled. No, looked toward Alina. It belongs to the journey. Lewis held the coin carefully. What should I do with it? Keep it. What? Thomas looked toward the ocean. To remember that the world is always larger than the map in front of you. Lewis nodded. I will. That afternoon, the expedition prepared to leave. The journey home would be difficult. They would retrace much of the wilderness they had crossed, but something had changed. They were no longer traveling toward an unknown destination. They were carrying knowledge back with them, maps, observations, stories, and memories. Before leaving, Alina stood alone on the beach. Lewis approached. "You're saying goodbye," she nodded. "To the place where I found my father," she looked at the ocean. "And to the place where I found you," Lewis smiled. "Not going anywhere," she laughed softly. "I know." They began walking toward the others. Behind them, the waves continued rolling toward the shore. The cave remained hidden beneath the cliff. The ancient maps remained safe. The gold remained untouched. And the secret of the forgotten settlement would never become the fortune Blackwood had imagined. Because Blackwood never found it, he had followed the expedition west. But by the time he reached the coast, the trail had disappeared. The tide had washed away their footprints. The cave entrance was hidden by rocks, and the treasure was once again protected by silence. Blackwood searched for weeks. He found nothing. Eventually, he turned back. The wilderness had defeated him, not with weapons, not with armies, but with distance, with patience, and with secrets that refused to be owned. Months later, Lewis and Clark returned east. The journey home was quieter. The rivers carried them slowly. The mountains disappeared behind them. The nights became warmer. And eventually, familiar settlements appeared again. Civilization, roads, houses, people. Yet Lewis often found himself thinking about the wilderness. He remembered the campfires, the mist over the river, the mountains beneath the moon, the hidden valley, the ancient maps, and Alina. One evening, as the expedition traveled along the Missouri, Lewis stood at the front of the boat. Clark joined him. "You're thinking about her again," Lewis smiled. "Perhaps," Clark laughed. "You know, for a man who went west to map a continent, you've returned with a completely different kind of discovery." Lewis looked at the river. "Will you do?" Lewis looked toward the horizon. "I think I'll find her," Clark smiled. "Good answer." The river carried them onward slowly, quietly toward home. And far away, beyond the mountains, the hidden cave remained untouched. The crescent symbol rested beneath the evening star. The old journals waited in darkness. And the forgotten stories of the continent remained safe. Perhaps one day, someone would find them again. Perhaps another traveler would follow the old trail. Perhaps another person would stand beside that ancient stone and wonder who had walked there before. But for Lewis and Alina, the greatest mystery had already been solved. They had gone looking for treasure. Instead, they had found history. They had gone looking for a lost father. Instead, they had found forgiveness. And somewhere between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean, two lonely travelers had discovered something neither map nor treasure could ever fully explain. They had found each other. The fire beside the river slowly faded. The night became quiet. The stars remained above the wilderness. And the great American frontier continued sleeping beneath the moon. Just as it had before them, and just as it would long after they were gone. Years passed quietly after the expedition. The great journey became a story told around fires in homes, and among travelers who wondered what Lewis and Clark had discovered beyond the mountains. Maps were drawn, journals were read. The names of rivers and mountains became familiar, but the deepest secret was never written down. Lewis kept the silver crescent coin. He kept it wrapped in a small piece of cloth, inside a wooden box. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and place it beside his journal. The coin always reminded him of the wilderness, and of Alina. Eventually, they found their way back to one another, not through another expedition, not through another dangerous trail, but through a quiet life far from the mountains. Alina had kept her father's journals. Thomas had spent his remaining years preserving the ancient records. The hidden maps were never sold. The gold was never claimed. Instead, the knowledge was carefully recorded and passed forward. One autumn evening, Lewis and Alina sat together beside a quiet river. The sunset reflected across the water. The air smelled of fallen leaves. Alina opened the old journal. "There is something I've never understood." Lewis looked at her. "What?" She turned to the final page. "Father wrote that the treasure would one day be found again." Lewis smiled. Perhaps he meant the records. "No," she pointed beneath the final sentence. There was a tiny drawing, the crescent moon, 3 mountains, and another symbol, a small star. Lewis stared at it. That wasn't there before. Alina shook her head. It was. Looked closer. Beneath the star were 4 faint words. "There is another beginning." Lewis laughed quietly. "After everything we've been through, you want to follow another mystery?" Alina closed the journal. "No," she looked toward the river. I think some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Lewis nodded. The two sat silently. The sun disappeared, the first stars appeared, and the river moved gently beside them. Perhaps the old treasure had never really been about gold. Perhaps it had been about memory, about the people who traveled before history remembered their names, about fathers and daughters, about friendships formed in dangerous places, about love discovered when two people were simply trying to survive. And perhaps that was why the treasure had remained hidden for so long, because the wilderness had never been protecting gold. It had been protecting stories, stories that could not be measured in coins, stories that could not be owned, stories that belonged to everyone who was willing to listen. Far away, beyond the mountains, the old cave remained. Rain fell across the entrance, snow covered the nearby peaks, the forests grew thicker, the trails slowly disappeared, years became decades, decades became generations, and eventually almost no one remembered the hidden valley. The crescent symbol disappeared beneath moss. The stone map weathered beneath the changing seasons. The old wooden chamber became part of the mountain. But the treasure remained, silent, patient, waiting, not for a wealthy man, not for someone searching for gold, but perhaps for someone who would understand what it truly meant. A traveler who would stand beneath the evening star and realize that the greatest discoveries are not always the ones that make a person rich. Sometimes they are the discoveries that make a person understand how small one life is, and how enormous the world can be. Tonight, as you imagine that distant wilderness, perhaps you can hear the same sounds Lewis once heard: the gentle movement of a river, the soft wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the quiet crackle of a campfire. And somewhere far beyond the mountains, the ocean touching the shore, the expedition is over. The treasure has been found. The lost father has been reunited with his daughter, and two travelers who once followed a mysterious coin have finally found their way home. The moon rises slowly above the dark landscape, the stars become brighter, the wilderness becomes quiet, and the old trail disappears into the night. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to fear, only the peaceful sound of the river moving beneath the moon. So let the story become quieter now. Let the mountains fade into darkness. Let the campfire become only a warm memory. And let the final image remain with you, Lewis and Alina, standing beside a peaceful river, beneath a sky full of stars, holding no treasure except the memories of a journey they would never forget. The wilderness sleeps, the river continues flowing, the moon watches silently, and somewhere beyond the distant mountains, the hidden treasure remains, waiting quietly, as it always has, as it always will. Good night. Long after the expedition had ended, the wilderness remained almost unchanged. The rivers continued their slow journeys toward the sea. The forests grew beneath changing seasons. Snow covered the mountains in winter and wildflowers returned in spring. The old trails slowly disappeared. But stories have a way of surviving. A trader might remember something. A traveler might repeat a rumor. A father might tell his child about a strange silver coin. And somewhere, far beyond the familiar roads, someone would eventually wonder about the crescent symbol. Perhaps that was how the secret was meant to survive, not as a treasure map, but as a story. One quiet evening, many years after the expedition, Lewis sat beside a small fire. The silver coin rested in his hand. Its surface had become darker with age. The crescent was still visible. He turned it slowly beneath the firelight. Alina sat beside him. "You still have it," Lewis smiled. "I told you I would." She looked at the coin. "Do you ever wish you had never found it?" Lewis thought about the question. "Not even once. Not even once." Alina looked toward the dark river. "Neither do I." The two remained silent. They had traveled far together. They had survived storms, mountains, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. But the memory that remained strongest was not the danger. It was the quiet moments, a campfire beneath the stars, a conversation beside a river, a hand reaching for another in the darkness, the sound of rain against canvas, the first sight of the Pacific. The moment Alina discovered her father was alive. Those were the moments that became their true treasure. Lewis placed the coin back into its wooden box. He closed the lid. "Perhaps someone will find it someday." Alina smiled. "Perhaps. And perhaps they'll wonder what it means." She looked at him. "Then they'll have to tell their own story." The fire slowly burned lower. The river reflected the moon. The night was peaceful. and for a moment the world seemed exactly as it had on that first night beside the Missouri, quiet. Unknown, full of possibilities somewhere in the distant mountains, the old stone chamber remained hidden. The entrance had almost completely disappeared beneath earth and moss. Inside, the ancient journals rested in darkness. The stone map still covered the wall. The crescent symbol remained carved above the western root, and beneath it, barely visible after many years, were the words, "What was hidden remains." Perhaps the treasure would never be found again. Perhaps it was better that way. Because some things become more valuable when they are not owned. The mountains did not belong to Lewis. They did not belong to Clark. They did not belong to Thomas. They did not belong to Blackwood. They simply existed, ancient, silent, patient. And the people who traveled through them were only visitors. That was the final lesson of the journey. The wilderness did not need to reveal all of its secrets. It only needed to reveal enough to change a life, enough to bring a daughter back to her father, enough to turn strangers into companions, enough to make two travelers understand that the world was much larger than anything they had imagined. And so the story of the hidden treasure slowly became part of the forgotten history of the frontier. There were no monuments, no golden statues, no great celebration, only a few journals, a silver coin, an old map, and the memory of a quiet journey across a continent. If someone ever discovered the ancient chamber again, they might expect to find mountains of gold. Instead, they would find something far more precious: stories, names, roots, memories, and the evidence that long before modern explorers crossed the continent, people had already understood its rivers, mountains, seasons, and paths. The real treasure had never belonged to the explorers. It belonged to the land, and the land had simply allowed them to see a small part of it. The night grows deeper now. The river becomes quieter. The wind moves softly through the trees. The stars remain above the sleeping wilderness. Perhaps somewhere in your imagination, you can see the old expedition once more. A small camp beside the water. A few warm lanterns, horses resting beneath the trees, Lewis writing quietly in his journal, Clark studying a map, Eleanor sitting near the fire, and beyond them, the endless American wilderness beneath the moon. No roads, no cities, no noise, only nature, only darkness, only stars. The journey is finished. The mystery is finished. The treasure has been found. And now there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the river carry the story away. Let the mountains disappear into the darkness. Let the old campfire become smaller and smaller. And let the final memory remain: a silver coin beneath the moon, a quiet river, a distant mountain, and two travelers who discovered that the greatest treasure was never hidden in a chest. It was hidden inside the journey itself. The wilderness sleeps, the river flows, the stars remain, and the forgotten trail slowly disappears beneath the night. Good night. The night continued quietly. The old river moved beneath the moon, carrying reflections of the stars across its dark surface. There was no sound of horses, no voices, no footsteps, only the soft wind moving through the trees. Yet somewhere in that peaceful darkness, the memory of the expedition remained. It remained in the river, in the mountains, in the old trails hidden beneath grass, and in the stories passed from one generation to another. Years after Lewis and Clark had returned from the West, travelers still spoke about the expedition. Some spoke about the enormous rivers, others spoke about the mountains, some remembered the difficult winter, and a few whispered about an old story involving a silver coin and a hidden chamber. But nobody knew the entire truth. Perhaps that was intentional. Lewis never wrote the complete story in his public journals. Clark avoided describing certain details. Thomas kept the ancient records hidden, and Eleanor understood why. The wilderness had given them something precious. It had also taught them that not every discovery needed to become public. Some knowledge had to be protected. Some stories needed time. One evening, Eleanor opened her father's journal again. She had read it many times, but that night she noticed something she had never seen before. A loose page was hidden inside the back cover. She carefully pulled it out. The writing was faint, her father's handwriting. She began reading. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then perhaps the journey has already changed you. I once believed that treasure meant wealth. I was wrong. Treasure is anything you would cross a wilderness to find." She stopped. Lewis looked over her shoulder. What else does it say? She continued. For some people it is gold, for others it is knowledge, for others it is home. And sometimes, without realizing it, a person begins a journey searching for one thing and discovers another. Alina lowered the page. She looked at Lewis. He smiled. Your father understood you, she nodded. He understood the journey. She folded the paper carefully. Then she placed it back inside the journal. Outside, rain began falling softly. The sound was gentle, almost comforting. Lewis listened. I always liked the sound of rain, Alina smiled. Did my father? They sat quietly. The rain continued, the river continued, and the old memories seemed to return like distant dreams. The Missouri, the mountains, the hidden valley, the cave, the Pacific, the evening star. Every moment had once felt dangerous. Now they felt almost peaceful, as though the wilderness had finally allowed them to rest far away. The ancient valley remained hidden. Spring came, then summer, then autumn. Winter covered the mountains again. The old stone buildings slowly disappeared beneath vines and moss. The trail became almost impossible to recognize, but the cave remained. Inside, the stone map still pointed west. The crescent moon still marked the ancient route, and the old journals waited in darkness. Perhaps no one would ever find them. Perhaps someone would. But if they did, they would discover the same lesson Lewis had learned. The world is larger than the stories we tell about it. History is deeper than the names remembered in books. And sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that never become famous. The final campfire slowly fades. The rain becomes softer. The forest becomes darker. The river continues moving beneath the moon. And somewhere in the distance, an owl calls once, then silence. Imagine the old wilderness now. A quiet trail disappearing between trees. A mountain rising beyond the mist. A small river reflecting the stars. And a single silver coin resting inside an old wooden box. Nothing moves, nothing demands attention. The story has reached its end. The treasure remains hidden. The memories remain. And the wilderness continues exactly as it always has, silent, patient, beautiful, waiting beneath the stars. So let the final sounds of the journey become softer. Let the river carry away every remaining thought. Let the mountains fade into the darkness. And let the old campfire become nothing more than a warm glow in the distance. Lewis and Clark have gone home. Alina has found her father. The secret has been protected. And the treasure has become what it was always meant to be, a story. A story about discovery, a story about mystery, a story about courage, a story about love, and a story about two travelers who crossed a continent and discovered that sometimes the greatest treasure is simply finding someone who will walk beside you through the unknown. The moon rises higher, the river flows quietly, the forest sleeps, and the last campfire disappears into the night. Good night. The morning after the rain was unusually bright. Mist floated above the river, and drops of water still rested on the leaves. Alina walked slowly beside the water, carrying her father's journal. She had spent much of the night thinking about the hidden valley. Something still bothered her. There was one question she had never asked. Why had her father chosen to remain hidden even after Blackwood disappeared? She found Lewis near the old campfire. He was preparing breakfast. You're awake early. So are you, Lewis smiled. What are you thinking about? Alina held up the journal. There is something I need to understand. They sat beneath a large tree. Alina opened the journal again. I read every page after we returned. And there is a missing section. Lewis looked at her. Missing section? Yes. She turned several pages. The writing suddenly stopped. Then it continued several pages later. There should be something between these entries. Lewis examined the old binding. Perhaps a page was removed. Alina nodded. Why? Before Lewis could answer, Thomas approached. He looked at the journal. His expression changed immediately. You found it. Alina stood. Found what? Thomas sat beside them, the part I hoped you would never need. He reached inside his coat and removed a small folded letter. I kept this for years. Alina stared at it. Why didn't you show me? Because I wanted you to have a peaceful life. She slowly opened the letter. The handwriting was her father's. The treasure is not the end. The records in the mountain are only one part of a much older story. There is another chamber. Lewis became still. Another chamber, Thomas nodded. It was never found. Alina continued reading. If the first chamber is discovered, someone will eventually search for the second. The second chamber contains something more dangerous than maps. Alina looked up. What? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. You wrote this. I wrote the warning. You never found the chamber. No, Lewis looked toward the distant mountains. Where is it supposed to be? Thomas pointed toward the journal. There is a clue. Read the final lines. When the river meets the forest and the forest meets the stone, follow the path that has no footprints. Clark suddenly approached. He had heard the last sentence. A path with no footprints. Lewis smiled. That sounds like something your father would write. Looked serious. It means a river. Clark understood. A river path, perhaps. Eleanor closed the journal. I thought the journey was over. Lewis looked at her. So did I. She smiled. Then why do I feel like we're about to begin another one? Lewis stood. Because you probably are. They did not leave immediately. For several days they studied the old maps. They compared the ancient drawings with the maps from the expedition. Slowly they discovered something unusual. A small river appeared on the ancient map. It did not appear on modern maps. Clark believed it had changed course over the years. Thomas remembered hearing stories about it. A narrow river flowing through a forest. A river that seemed to disappear underground. Eleanor traced the route with her finger. If this is correct, the second chamber could be here. Lewis nodded. That is several days from the old valley. Looked at him. If we go there, we'll find out. Smiled. You haven't changed. Lewis laughed. Neither have you. Expedition prepared quietly. There would be no large group this time. Only a few trusted companions. No announcement. No treasure hunters. No rumors. They would follow the old river. And if the second chamber existed, they would find it. That evening, Eleanor and Lewis stood beside the river. The sunset was fading. She looked at him. Do you ever get tired of mysteries? Sometimes. Adventure? Occasionally, she smiled. Then why are you coming? Lewis looked toward her. Because you're going. Eleanor lowered her eyes. For a moment the world seemed completely still. Then she quietly said, I'm glad. The river flowed beside them. The sky darkened. And somewhere beyond the trees an unknown trail waited. Not for gold, not for fame, but for one final secret that had remained hidden since long before Lewis and Clark ever entered the wilderness. And this time they would follow a river that left no footprints. The next morning they left before sunrise. The river was covered with a thin layer of mist. Lewis walked at the front of the small group, carrying the old map. Eleanor followed beside him. Behind them came Thomas and Clark. The forest was quiet. Only the occasional sound of birds disturbed the morning silence. For several hours they followed the river. It became narrower as they traveled. The water moved between tall trees and smooth stones. Then near midday, Eleanor noticed something strange. The river disappeared, not gradually, not beneath a bridge. It simply vanished into the ground. She stopped. Lewis, he turned. What is it? She pointed ahead. The river flowed toward a wall of stone, then disappeared beneath it. Clark approached. The water must be running underneath the mountain. Nodded. That is what my father wrote about. Eleanor opened the journal. There was a drawing of the same place. A river entering a stone wall, and beside it a small crescent. Lewis examined the rock. Look. Was a narrow opening between two enormous stones. Cold air came from inside. Thomas whispered, the path with no footprints. They entered. The passage was dark and narrow. The sound of underground water echoed beneath their feet. After several minutes, the tunnel widened. The ceiling rose above them, and then they saw something that made everyone stop. An underground river. It flowed through a vast cavern beneath the mountain. Small crystals covered parts of the walls, reflecting the lantern light. Eleanor stared in amazement. Never seen anything like this. Lewis smiled. Neither have I. They followed the underground river. The passage continued deeper. Eventually they reached a wooden platform. It was ancient, yet strangely well preserved. On the platform was a small chest. Lewis approached it carefully. Eleanor held the lantern higher. There was no lock, no warning. Just the crescent symbol. Lewis opened the lid. Inside was not gold. There was a single bundle of letters, and beneath them, a small portrait. Eleanor picked it up. Her expression suddenly changed. She knew the face. That's my grandfather. Stared at the portrait for a long time. He said nothing. Then he whispered, I thought this was lost. Eleanor turned the portrait over. Something was written on the back. To the family that finds this. The treasure was never meant to be taken. It was meant to be remembered. Thomas closed his eyes. His father's handwriting. A final message from a man who had disappeared decades earlier. Eleanor opened the first letter. The story inside was unlike anything they expected. Her grandfather had discovered the underground river while traveling west. He had found evidence that generations of travelers had used the cavern as a hidden route through the mountains. They had left behind maps, journals, tools, and records, not because they wanted to hide wealth, but because they wanted to protect knowledge from those who would use it for power. Lewis slowly understood. The hidden treasure was not one treasure, it was a chain of memories. Each generation had protected what the previous generation had left behind. Thomas looked at Alina. That's why my father stayed, she nodded. He was protecting the same secret. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the cavern. Footsteps, everyone turned. Clark extinguished the lantern. The cavern fell into darkness. Another sound. Closer this time, someone was coming through the tunnel. Thomas, Lewis shook his head. Couldn't have followed us. Looked toward the darkness. He doesn't need to. A faint light appeared at the far end of the cavern, then a man's voice echoed across the underground river. You've done the hard part for me. Alina gripped Lewis's hand. The voice continued. Now give me the map. Lewis looked toward the ancient chest, then toward the dark tunnel. The treasure had been found again. But this time there was nowhere easy to run. The underground river flowed silently beside them, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the man who had hunted the secret for years was finally waiting. The final confrontation had begun. The voice echoed through the cavern. Give me the map. No one answered. Lewis stood beside the underground river, holding the old map close to his chest. Alina remained beside him. Thomas looked toward the darkness. You followed us. Blackwood stepped into the lantern light. His coat was covered in dust. His face looked tired, but his eyes were still sharp. Behind him stood several men. Blackwood smiled. You always were difficult to find. Thomas stared at him. And you were always too stubborn to stop searching. Looked toward Alina. You have your father's eyes. Alina said nothing. He turned back to Lewis. The map. Lewis shook his head. No, Blackwood's smile disappeared. You don't understand what you have. I understand enough. It could make us rich. Lewis looked at the ancient letters. No. It could give us control over trade routes across the West. No, Blackwood stepped closer. You explorers claim to want knowledge. Lewis looked directly at him. We do. Then why keep it? Not everything should belong to the person who finds it. For a moment Blackwood was silent, then he laughed. You sound like Thomas, smiled faintly. Perhaps that's because he learned. Blackwood raised his weapon. The cavern became completely still. Then Alina stepped forward. Wait. Lewis looked at her. She held the portrait of her grandfather. Look at this. Blackwood glanced at it. What is that? The real treasure, he laughed. A portrait. No, Alina opened the old letters. These records belong to people who crossed this continent before you ever heard of them. She held up the journal. They trusted someone to protect their knowledge. Blackwood shook his head. Knowledge is power. Alina replied quietly. Only when someone uses it to control others. Blackwood stared at her. For a moment his expression softened. Then he looked toward the ancient river. You don't understand. I understand more than you think. Blackwood turned toward the cavern wall. His eyes suddenly widened. The stone map had begun to reflect the lantern light. A hidden section appeared, another route, another symbol. Blackwood stepped closer. What is that? Lewis looked. A small star appeared beneath the western route. Thomas whispered, the last chamber. Smiled. Then we continue. He moved toward the passage. But Thomas stopped him. You won't find it. Blackwood raised his weapon. Move. Thomas didn't. You've spent your entire life searching for gold. Looked around the cavern, and you still don't understand what you've been chasing. Blackwood's expression hardened, then the ground trembled. A deep rumble moved through the mountain. Water suddenly rushed through the underground river. Everyone stepped back. The ancient platform shook. A section of the cavern ceiling cracked. Clark shouted, out. The men began running. Blackwood looked toward the hidden chamber. He hesitated. For the first time, greed had made him choose badly. He ran toward the treasure instead of the exit. A large piece of stone fell behind him. The passage collapsed. Lewis grabbed Alina's hand. Go. They followed Clark toward the tunnel. Thomas remained behind. Alina looked back. Father, Thomas shouted, keep going. Another collapse shook the cavern. Then the lanterns went dark. The group escaped through the narrow passage just as water flooded the chamber. They emerged into the forest beneath a gray morning sky. Everyone stood silently. The mountain was quiet again. Alina looked toward the entrance. Father, Lewis placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll find him. She shook her head. No, she looked at the mountain. He knew what he was doing. The mountain. Thomas had stayed behind to close the passage. The secret would remain safe. And Blackwood, no one ever saw him again. The mountain had taken him into darkness. Perhaps he had survived. Perhaps he had found another passage. But the ancient treasure was safe once more. The old map was still with Lewis. The letters were with Alina, and the stories would survive. The three travelers stood beneath the trees. The rain began softly. Alina looked at Lewis. "What now?" He looked toward the river. "Now we go home," she nodded. And as they began walking, the clouds slowly opened. A single beam of sunlight touched the mountain. For just a moment, a small crescent-shaped reflection appeared on the wet stone. Then it disappeared. The secret remained. The wilderness had spoken, and this time it had chosen silence. The road home was quieter than the journey west. The small group followed the river beneath a sky filled with soft gray clouds. For several days, no one spoke much about the mountain. Alina carried her father's journal close to her heart. Lewis carried the old map. Clark carried the memories of everything they had seen. And somewhere behind them, beneath stone and water, the hidden chamber had disappeared once again. They never returned to it. Perhaps they never should. The wilderness had protected its secret for generations. Now it would protect it for generations more. One evening, they stopped beside a calm river. The rain had ended. Mist rose from the water. Alina sat beside Lewis near the fire. "Do you think my father survived?" Lewis looked into the flames. "I don't know." She nodded. "I think he wanted the mountain to close. He knew that if the treasure remained accessible, someone would always come looking for it." Lewis understood. Thomas had chosen the secret over himself, and perhaps that was the final sacrifice of the journey. Alina looked toward the river. "I used to think finding my father would answer everything. No," she smiled sadly. "It gave me more questions." Lewis laughed softly. "That's what exploration does." She looked at him. "Then perhaps I should stop exploring." Lewis smiled. "I don't believe you can." For a moment they simply listened to the river. Then Alina leaned gently against his shoulder. The fire burned quietly. Above them the stars began appearing through the clouds. There was no danger tonight, no enemy, no hidden footsteps, only past. The mountains became distant. The forests slowly opened. Familiar landscapes began returning. Eventually they reached the Missouri River. Lewis stood at the water's edge. He remembered the first time he had seen it. Then he had believed the river was carrying him toward the greatest discovery of his life. Now he understood that the river had been carrying him toward something completely different. A mystery, a friendship, a love, a family reunited, and a lesson he would never forget. Clark stood beside him. "We made it." Lewis nodded. "Yes." Clark looked toward Alina. "She changed the journey." Lewis smiled. "She did." Alina approached them. She held the old journal. "I found something." Lewis raised an eyebrow. "Another secret," she laughed. No, she opened the journal. Inside was a final page she had not seen before. Only a few words were written there. "When the journey ends, remember where it began." Alina closed the book. Lewis looked at the river. "Perhaps that's the real treasure," she smiled. "What?" "The beginning." Years later, when people asked Lewis about the expedition, he spoke about the rivers. He spoke about the mountains. He spoke about the wildlife and the vast landscapes. He spoke about the people they met along the way. But he never told the complete story of the hidden treasure. Some memories were too precious to turn into public stories. The silver coin remained with him. The ancient map remained hidden. And Alina kept her father's journal safe. The truth about the underground chamber slowly became another forgotten story. A story with no official ending. A story without a monument. A story without a treasure displayed in a museum. But perhaps that was exactly how it was meant to be. Because the wilderness had never promised to reveal everything. It had only opened one door. And through that door, Lewis and Clark had seen a world much older and larger than themselves. They had learned that history did not begin when explorers arrived. The land already had stories. The rivers already had names. The mountains already held memories. And the people who lived there already knew the paths. The explorers had simply been fortunate enough to witness a small part of it that night. Alina and Lewis stood beside the river one final time. The moon was bright. The water reflected it perfectly. She looked at him. "Do you remember the first night?" Lewis smiled. "The coin, the woman in the forest." He laughed. "You were following us. You were following me. You frightened me. I thought you were the dangerous one." They both laughed quietly. Then Alina reached into her pocket. She held the silver coin. The crescent symbol caught the moonlight. Lewis looked at it. "Keep it," she smiled. I thought you had it. I think it belongs with you now." She closed her fingers around it. The river moved gently beside them. No more journeys were necessary, no more secrets needed to be solved. The treasure had already given them everything it could, a story worth remembering, a life worth living, and someone worth walking beside. The moon climbed higher. The camp became quiet. The forest slept. And somewhere far away, beyond mountains and forgotten trails, the old chamber remained hidden beneath the earth. Its maps waited, its letters waited, its secrets waited. But tonight there was nothing left to discover, only the soft sound of the river, only the whisper of the wind, only the stars above, and the peaceful knowledge that some treasures are most beautiful when they remain hidden. The journey was over, the wilderness was quiet, and the last light of the campfire slowly disappeared. Good night. The years passed gently. The great expedition slowly became a memory, but Alina never forgot the nights beside the river. Sometimes, when rain touched the windows, she remembered the hidden cave. When the moon was bright, she remembered the silver coin. And whenever she heard the distant sound of running water, she remembered the journey west. One autumn evening, she and Louis returned to the same quiet river where their journey had truly begun. The trees had turned golden. Leaves floated slowly across the water. Alina carried her father's journal. Louis carried a small wooden box. They sat beside the river without speaking. Finally, Alina opened the journal. "There is one more page." Louis looked at her. "You're sure?" She nodded. The page was old and fragile. She read slowly. "The world will forget many names. It will forget many roads. It may even forget this place. But if two people ever find one another while searching for something they cannot name, then the journey was worth beginning." Alina became quiet. Louis looked toward the river. "I think your father knew more than he ever told us." She smiled. "He knew people." Wind moved gently through the trees. Alina closed the journal. "What do you think happened to the treasure?" Louis smiled. "Which treasure?" "The gold. Probably still in the mountain. Maps, perhaps hidden somewhere safe. Letters, with you." She looked at him. "The greatest treasure?" Louis turned toward her. "I think you already know." Alina smiled. For a moment, neither spoke. The river continued its slow journey beneath the evening sky. The same river that had carried them west. The same river that had brought them home. And perhaps that was enough. They had searched for something hidden in the wilderness. Instead, they had discovered that the most important things could never truly be buried. Love could not be buried. Memory could not be buried. A story could not be buried. And the people we carry in our hearts could never completely disappear. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. The first stars appeared. Louis closed the wooden box. Inside was the old silver coin. The crescent symbol remained visible. He placed the box beside Alina. "We should keep this together." She nodded. "Together." The word remained between them like a promise. No more expeditions, no more dangerous mountains, no more men searching for gold, only quiet evenings, rivers, rain, and a life shared beneath ordinary skies. Far away, the hidden valley remained untouched. The old stone chamber slept beneath the mountain. Ancient maps waited in darkness, and the secret of the treasure remained exactly where it belonged, hidden, safe, silent. The moon rose above the river. Alina rested her head gently against Louis's shoulder. The water whispered against the shore. The forest became still. And the final mystery of their journey was no longer where the treasure had been hidden. It was how two people searching for something lost had somehow found a future together. The river flowed, the stars watched, and the wilderness finally became quiet. Good night. The river was almost perfectly still that night. Moonlight rested upon the water like a silver path, stretching quietly toward the distant trees. Louis and Alina remained beside the shore. Neither wanted to leave. After everything they had experienced, ordinary silence felt precious. Alina slowly opened her father's journal one final time. There was a small note written on the inside cover. She had seen it many times before, but never truly understood it. "Some roads disappear because they have reached their destination." She read the sentence aloud. Louis smiled. "Maybe our road has disappeared." Alina looked at him. "Do you think it has?" He glanced toward the river. "No. Rivers don't disappear when they reach the sea. They simply become something else." Alina smiled. "Then perhaps our journey is simply becoming something else." They sat quietly. The fire beside them had almost burned out. A gentle breeze moved through the grass. Far away, an owl called once. Then the wilderness became silent again. Lewis looked toward the mountains. He knew that somewhere beyond them was the old valley. Somewhere beneath stone and earth was the hidden chamber. Somewhere, perhaps, another traveler might someday discover the ancient records. But he no longer felt the need to return. The mystery had given him what he needed. He had learned that exploration was not always about reaching the farthest place. Sometimes it was about understanding what you found along the way. Alina closed the journal. You missed the wilderness, Lewis thought for a moment. Would you go back? He smiled. Perhaps one day. She leaned closer. Then I'll go with you, Lewis laughed softly. I was hoping you would say that. Last ember of the fire disappeared, darkness surrounded them, but it was not frightening, it was peaceful. The river whispered beside them, the moon remained above, and the stars filled the endless sky. For Lewis and Alina, there was nothing left to chase. The treasure was hidden. The past had been forgiven, the journey had found its meaning, and the future was waiting quietly beyond the next morning. They stood and walked away from the river together. Behind them, the water continued flowing. It carried no treasure, no map, no secret, only the reflections of the stars. And perhaps that was enough, because some journeys end with a discovery, others end with a home, and the rarest journeys end with both. The wilderness grew quiet. The river continued toward the distant sea. The moon slowly crossed the sky, and the story of the hidden treasure finally became a memory, soft, distant, and peaceful. A story to be remembered beneath the stars. A story to fall asleep to. Good night. Several months passed after that quiet evening beside the river. Life appeared peaceful again. The old expedition had become a distant memory, and the wilderness seemed to belong to another time. But some secrets do not disappear simply because people stop looking for them. They wait, quietly, patiently. And sometimes they return when they are least expected. One cold morning, Lewis received a small package. There was no name on it, no address. Only a crescent moon carved into the wooden lid. He carried it inside and waited until Alina arrived. She recognized the symbol immediately. Where did you get that? It was delivered this morning. She stared at the box. For several seconds, neither of them touched it. Finally, Lewis opened the lid. Inside was a folded piece of parchment. The paper was old. Much older than the expedition itself. Alina carefully unfolded it. A map appeared. But this map was different from the ones they had seen in the mountains. It showed a river they did not recognize, a small settlement, 3 mountains, and beyond them a large circle drawn in faded ink. At the bottom of the map were 6 words, "The treasure has another guardian." Alina read the sentence twice, then she looked at Lewis. "I thought we were finished." "So did I." She traced the map with her finger. "There is something else." "What?" "Look here." Near the edge of the parchment was a small mark. A woman's name, Margaret Vale. Alina became completely still. "Grandmother." Lewis looked at her. "Your grandmother? She disappeared before my father was born." Room suddenly felt colder. Alina turned the parchment over. On the back was another message. If Thomas found the first chamber, then Margaret found the second. Lewis slowly sat down. "Your family has been connected to this mystery for generations." Alina nodded. "And I thought my father was the end of it." She looked toward the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall softly. The sound filled the quiet room. Lewis looked at the map again. "Where does this river lead?" Alina studied the markings. "I don't know." Then she noticed something. The river ended beside a tiny symbol, a crescent moon. But beneath it was something neither of them had seen before, a small key. Alina whispered, "There must be a door." Lewis looked at her. "Then somewhere someone has been waiting for us to find it." Neither of them knew who had sent the map. Neither knew whether the sender was a friend or an enemy. But one thing was certain. The mystery they believed had ended had never truly ended. It had only become quieter. And somewhere beyond the familiar rivers, hidden beneath forests that few people had ever entered, another chamber was waiting. This time, the treasure was not protected by Blackwood. It was protected by someone from Alina's own family. Someone whose name had disappeared from every known record. Someone who might still be alive. Alina folded the map. "We should go." Lewis smiled. "I knew you were going to say that." She looked at him. "And you're coming." He stood, "Of course." Outside, the rain continued falling. The road ahead was unknown. The old mystery had returned. And somewhere beyond the western forests, a forgotten guardian was waiting beneath the crescent moon. The journey began quietly. There was no large expedition this time. No banners, No soldiers, only Lewis, Alina, and a few trusted companions. The old map remained carefully wrapped inside Alina's satchel. They traveled west again, following the river shown on the parchment. For several days the landscape changed slowly. Fields became forests. The roads became narrow trails. Eventually even the trails disappeared. Only the river remained. One evening they stopped beneath enormous pine trees. Rain fell gently through the branches. Lewis built a small fire beneath a rocky overhang. Alina sat beside him, studying the map. "You know what bothers me?" Lewis looked at her. "Everything," she smiled. "Almost." She pointed toward the parchment. "The map shows a settlement here. And there is nothing on any modern map." Lewis looked closer. Maybe it disappeared, or maybe someone wanted it forgotten. A soft silence followed. The fire crackled. Rain touched the leaves. Then Alina noticed something between the trees, a faint light. She stood. Lewis. He turned. "What?" "There." A small lantern was moving through the forest. Someone was walking toward them. Lewis immediately stood. The figure stopped several yards away. It was an elderly woman. Her hair was silver. She carried a wooden walking stick, and around her neck hung a small crescent pendant. Alina stared. The woman looked directly at her. "You have your grandmother's eyes." Alina could barely speak. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer. "Name is Abigail." Lewis looked at Alina. Alina whispered, "Margaret's sister." Nodded. "She was my sister." Alina stepped forward. "Where is she?" The old woman lowered her eyes. "She is gone." "When?" "Many years ago." Alina's voice trembled. "How?" Abigail looked toward the dark forest. "She found the second chamber." Lewis stepped closer. "What happened?" Abigail sighed. "Your grandmother believed the first chamber was only a hiding place. The second, a sanctuary." "What?" Abigail looked at Alina. "For people who needed to disappear." Alina frowned. "I don't understand." Explorers, travelers, families, people who were being hunted, people who carried knowledge that powerful men wanted. Lewis remembered Thomas, and Margaret protected them. "Yes, how many?" "Many." Turned toward the forest. "Eventually someone betrayed her." Alina's face became pale. "Who?" Abigail did not answer. Instead, she pointed toward the trees. "Follow me." They walked through the forest for nearly an hour. The rain gradually stopped. The moon appeared between the clouds. At last, Abigail stopped beside an enormous fallen tree. She moved several stones away. Beneath them was a narrow wooden door. Alina stared. "The entrance." Nodded. "This is the second chamber." Lewis looked at the door. There was no lock, only the crescent symbol. Alina reached toward it. Before her fingers touched the wood, Abigail spoke. "Once you open this door, you cannot pretend you never saw what is inside." Alina looked at Lewis. He nodded quietly. She placed her hand on the crescent. The door slowly opened. Cold air flowed from the darkness. Inside was a long underground passage. But unlike the old cave, this place was not empty. There were shelves, blankets, old cooking pots, children's toys, books, and dozens of names carved into the walls. Alina moved closer. She recognized one, Thomas Vale. Her father had been here. But beneath his name was another, Margaret Vale, her grandmother. Alina touched the stone. Then she saw something else. A third name, one she had never heard before, Samuel Lewis. Lewis stared at it. "That isn't possible." Turned toward him. "Oh, but it is." Lewis felt a chill. "Who was Samuel Lewis?" The old woman smiled faintly. "Grandfather." The forest outside became completely silent. Lewis looked at Alina. Alina looked back at him. Two families, two mysteries, and now one hidden chamber connecting them both. Abigail slowly closed the door behind them. "Now," she whispered, "you are finally ready to learn why your families were brought together." Deeper inside the chamber, a small lantern suddenly flickered to life. Someone was already there. The lantern flickered again, once, twice, then a quiet voice came from the darkness. "You took your time." Alina froze. Lewis instinctively stepped closer to her. Abigail did not seem surprised. She simply looked toward the far end of the chamber. "Come out." Slow footsteps echoed through the passage. A man appeared beneath the lantern. He was older, perhaps in his 70s. His clothes were simple, dusty, and worn from years spent in the forest, but his eyes were remarkably clear. Alina stared at him. "Who are you?" The stranger looked at her for a long moment, then he smiled. "Name is Samuel." Lewis felt his heart stop for a moment. "Samuel Lewis," the old man nodded. Lewis stepped forward. "That was my grandfather's name." "I know." "How?" Samuel looked toward the stone wall. "Because I was there when he carved his name." The chamber suddenly felt smaller. Lewis looked at Abigail. "You said my grandfather disappeared." "He did," Abigail replied. But he wasn't dead, Samuel shook his head. Louis could barely speak. Why didn't he come home? Samuel looked at him. Because there was nothing left for him to return to, Louis frowned. What happened? Samuel walked toward an old wooden table. On it lay several journals. He picked up one. Your grandfather discovered the first hidden settlement many years before your expedition. Louis stared at him. Before I was born. Yes, he met Margaret there. Samuel nodded. Thomas, yes. And together they protected the people who used these hidden places. Alina looked around the chamber. Who were those people? Samuel opened the journal. People carrying information that powerful men wanted. He turned several pages, maps of rivers, of mountain passes, from native communities, locations of hidden settlements, and evidence of trading routes that could change the balance of power in the West. Louis slowly understood the treasure was never simply gold. It was information powerful enough to make men wealthy or start wars. Alina touched one of the old books. My grandmother protected all this. Yes, my father. He continued her work. She looked down. Then why did he disappear? Samuel became quiet. Because Blackwood found out. Louis's expression hardened. He followed them. He followed everyone. Samuel walked toward another wall. There beneath several faded names was a small mark, a black circle. Alina recognized it immediately. Blackwood. Samuel nodded. He wasn't the beginning of the danger. Louis looked at him. What do you mean? Samuel's eyes became serious. Blackwood was only one man. Then who was behind him? Samuel reached beneath the table. He removed a sealed envelope. The wax seal carried a symbol neither Louis nor Alina had seen before. A black crescent. He placed it on the table. This organization has existed for generations. Alina stared at the seal. Many people know about it. Very few. They are still looking for the treasure. Samuel nodded. They don't want the gold. Then what do they want? Samuel looked directly at Louis. They want the map. Louis immediately understood. The ancient map did not merely show rivers and mountains. It showed hidden routes across the continent, routes that could allow someone to move armies, goods, and people without being seen. Whoever controlled it could control the wilderness. Samuel opened the envelope. Inside was another map, but this one was smaller. It showed a single mountain. At its center was a dark mark. Alina leaned closer. What is that? Samuel whispered. The final chamber. Louis looked at him. You found it? Samuel shook his head. Then who did? Samuel's expression changed. Sister. Alina's eyes widened. Margaret. Yes. Is she? Samuel looked toward the passage behind them. She is closer than you think. A faint sound suddenly came from somewhere beyond the chamber. 3 slow knocks. Everyone became silent. Knock, knock, knock. Samuel turned toward the hidden doorway. She knows we're here. Alina's heart began beating faster. Who? Samuel looked at her. Your grandmother. The lantern flame trembled. And from the darkness beyond the stone wall came a woman's voice. Alina. Alina stopped breathing. She knew that voice. She had heard it once in an old recording. Her grandmother was alive, and she had been waiting for her. The voice came again, softer this time. Alina, come closer. Could not move. For years she had imagined what her grandmother might have looked like. She had seen only one faded photograph. A young woman standing beside a river, smiling toward the camera. Now that same woman was speaking from somewhere beyond the stone wall. Alina looked at Samuel. You said she was alive. I said she was closer than you thought. Louis gently touched Alina's hand. Take your time. She nodded. Abigail walked toward the wall. She pressed her palm against a small stone. A hidden mechanism clicked. Part of the wall slowly moved inward. Beyond it was another chamber. A warm lantern burned inside. And sitting beside a wooden table was an elderly woman. Her hair was completely white. Her face was lined with age. But her eyes were unmistakably the same eyes Alina had seen in the old photograph. Alina whispered, Grandmother. The woman looked at her. Tears appeared in her eyes. You finally came. Alina stepped into the room. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Alina ran forward. The old woman stood with difficulty. They embraced. Alina began crying. You were alive all this time. Her grandmother held her tightly. I wanted to come home. Then why didn't you? Because coming home would have brought danger to everyone. Alina pulled back. Father knew. He knew enough. Why didn't he tell me? Because he loved you. Alina looked away. For the first time, the anger she had carried for years began to soften. Her grandmother touched her face. You look so much like your mother. Alina smiled through tears. I don't remember her very well. I remember everything. The room became quiet. Lewis stood near the doorway. The old woman looked toward him. "And you must be Lewis." Nodded. "How do you know my name?" She smiled. "Because Samuel told me." Samuel entered the room. He arrived with the map. Lewis looked at him. "What map?" Samuel pointed toward the table. The ancient map was lying open. Alina's grandmother slowly placed her hand upon it. "This is the last map." Lewis stepped closer. "What does it show?" She pointed toward the mountains. "The final chamber." Lewis studied the markings. "This mountain, yes, it's near the western coast." Her grandmother nodded. "But there is something you don't know." "What?" "The chamber is not empty." Alina looked at her. "What is inside?" Her grandmother hesitated. "Something your grandfather discovered." Lewis frowned. "Samuel said your family protected knowledge." "Did? Then what is so dangerous about this chamber?" Her grandmother looked directly at him. "Because it contains proof." "Of what?" She slowly turned the map. Beneath the mountain was a second drawing, a ship, a river, and a series of names. These records prove that people from different parts of the world were traveling through this continent long before anyone believed it possible. Lewis stared at the drawing. "That would change history." "Yes, powerful people would want it." "Exactly." Alina looked at the map. "The treasure is historical evidence." Her grandmother nodded. "But there is more." She reached beneath the table. She removed a small wooden box. Inside was a silver key. The crescent symbol was carved into its handle. "This opens the final chamber." Lewis looked at the key. "Why haven't you opened it?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Because I was waiting for the right people." Alina understood. "You were waiting for me." "For you?" Her grandmother looked at Lewis. "And for him." A soft silence filled the room. Outside, rain began falling against the forest. Her grandmother closed the box. The journey must begin again. Lewis looked toward Alina. She was already looking at him. Neither needed to speak. They knew. The mystery that had followed their families for generations was finally leading them toward its final destination. But before they could leave, 3 horses suddenly galloped past the hidden entrance. Samuel rushed toward the doorway. He returned moments later. His face had changed. "They found us." Lewis stood. "Who?" Samuel looked toward the forest. "The men carrying the black crescent." The grandmother quietly picked up the silver key. "Then we have very little time." Somewhere beyond the trees, another lantern appeared, then another, then another. The hunters had arrived. The lanterns moved slowly between the trees, one, then another, then several more. The forest that had seemed peaceful only moments before was now surrounded. Samuel quietly closed the hidden door. "No one speaks." Everyone listened. Rain fell softly on the leaves. Horses moved somewhere beyond the trees. Then a man's voice called from the darkness. "We know you're inside." Alina's grandmother remained completely calm. She turned toward Samuel. "How many?" "At least 10. Lewis looked at Clark. Clark had already understood. "Can't fight our way through." Samuel shook his head. "We don't need to," pointed toward the floor. There was a small wooden panel beneath the table. Alina's grandmother opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. "The old escape route," she whispered. Lewis looked at the map. "Where does it lead?" "To the river." Alina took the silver key. Her grandmother placed her hand over Alina's, carefully. Alina looked at her. "If they catch us, they will take the map." "I won't let them." "I know," her grandmother smiled. "That is why I waited for you." A loud knock struck the hidden door. Everyone froze. "Open the door." The voice was closer now. Lewis whispered, "We have to move." Samuel led the way down the stairs. Alina followed. Her grandmother came behind her. Lewis and Clark stayed at the rear. The passage was narrow. Cold water covered the stone floor. Above them, the sounds of the men entering the chamber grew louder. Then a heavy crash echoed through the tunnel. "They found the room," Samuel whispered. They moved faster. The passage eventually opened into a large underground cavern. A river flowed through it. A small wooden boat waited beside the bank. Alina stared. "Old is this?" "Older than any of us," Samuel replied. They climbed aboard. Lewis pushed the boat into the current. The underground river carried them silently through the darkness. No one spoke. The only sound was the water beneath the boat. After several minutes, Alina looked back. A faint lantern appeared far behind them. "They're following us." Samuel nodded. "They know the tunnels." Lewis looked at the map. "Where does this river lead?" Her grandmother answered, "To the mountain." "Final chamber." "Yes." Lewis studied the route. "The current is moving toward it." "Exactly." Boat continued. The cavern grew wider. Then the ceiling suddenly opened. Moonlight poured through a crack high above. Alina looked up. The stars were visible. They had reached an enormous natural chamber inside the mountain. At the far end stood a stone doorway, no wood, no metal, just ancient stone, and carved across it was the crescent symbol. Alina held up the silver key. Her grandmother whispered, "This is the door." They pulled the boat onto the shore. Everyone stepped out. Lewis approached the stone entrance. "There is no keyhole." Alina looked at the key. Her grandmother pointed toward the crescent carving. "Press it there." Alina placed the key against the symbol. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. A deep sound moved through the mountain. Stone shifted. Dust fell from the ceiling. Then the doorway slowly opened. Warm air flowed from inside. Beyond the door was a chamber unlike anything they had seen before. The walls were covered with paintings, ships, rivers, mountains, people traveling through the continent. And at the center of the chamber stood a large stone table. On it was a sealed wooden chest. Alina stepped forward. "This is it." Her grandmother nodded. "The final treasure." Lewis looked toward the chest. "What is inside?" Her grandmother smiled. "The truth." Behind them came a sudden sound, footsteps. The hunters had reached the cavern. Samuel turned. "They're here." Lewis stood between Alina and the entrance. The stone doorway remained open. Black figures appeared at the far end of the cavern, and at the front of them stood a man Alina recognized. He was older now, but the black crescent remained on his coat. He smiled. "You found it." Lewis raised his weapon. The man looked at the chest. "You have no idea what is inside." Alina held the silver key. "Yes." She looked at her grandmother. "We finally do." Man slowly stepped closer. "Then you know why I cannot let you leave." Cavern became silent. The underground river flowed behind them. The ancient paintings watched from the walls. And inside the wooden chest was the secret that two families had protected for generations. A secret that could change the history of the continent forever. The man with the black crescent stepped closer. His name was Elias. Alina remembered seeing it in one of her grandmother's old journals. Elias had once been a trusted friend of the family. Now he stood on the other side. "You were the one who sent the map," Alina said. Elias smiled. "I needed you to open the door." Her grandmother's expression hardened. "You always were impatient. You were always afraid. I was protecting people. You were protecting a lie." Lewis stepped forward. "What lie?" Elias pointed toward the stone chest. "The world has been told one version of history." Looked around the chamber. The truth inside that chest would destroy it. Lewis shook his head. "Truth doesn't destroy history. People do." For a moment no one spoke. Then Elias slowly lowered his weapon. "I don't want to fight you." Alina looked surprised. "Then why did you follow us?" "Because the chest must be opened." Her grandmother stared at him. "You came for the records." "No." Looked at Alina. "I came because only your family can open it." Alina looked at the silver key. "Why?" "Because your ancestors made the promise." "Promise?" Elias pointed toward the stone table. There, carved into the table, were two names, Vale and Lewis. Between them was the crescent symbol. Beneath it were several words. "The truth shall belong to no single family." Lewis stared at the inscription. "Grandfather knew." "Yes," Elias said. "Margaret, she helped write it." Alina looked at her grandmother. "You knew all along." Her grandmother nodded. "I never knew whether the world was ready." Stepped toward the chest. "Maybe it is now." Lewis studied him carefully. "Why should we trust you?" "You shouldn't." Looked toward the entrance. "The evidence." Stepped aside. Alina approached the chest. Her hands trembled slightly. She inserted the silver key. The lock opened with a deep metallic sound. For several seconds she did not lift the lid. Then she looked at Lewis. He nodded. Together they opened it. Inside were hundreds of pages, old maps, letters, paintings, small objects wrapped in cloth. And beneath everything was a large leather-bound book. Alina lifted it carefully. The title was written in faded ink. "The First Record of the Western Journey." Lewis opened the book. The first page contained a date decades before their expedition. He turned the page. There were descriptions of rivers, mountains, forests, and encounters with communities who had guided travelers through the continent. But one section made Lewis stop. It described a route across the mountains. A route that later became one of the most important trails used by explorers. The writer explained that the route had been taught to them by people who had lived there for generations. Lewis slowly closed the book. "This changes everything." Nodded. "That is why it was hidden." Alina looked through another bundle of papers. Then she found a letter. The handwriting was familiar, her grandfather's. She began reading. "If you are reading this, the chamber has finally been opened. Remember this?" No explorer discovers a land that was empty. Every river has been known by someone. Every mountain has been remembered by someone. Every trail has been walked before. Aliner's eyes filled with tears, she continued. If my descendants ever reach this place, let them carry the truth home, not for wealth, not for glory, but so that those forgotten voices are never forgotten again. The chamber became silent. Even Elias lowered his head. Lewis looked at Aliner. She closed the letter. We should take the records. Her grandmother shook her head. Not all of them. The chamber must remain. Nodded. She's right. Lewis understood. The records could be copied. The originals could remain protected. They could preserve history without exposing the hidden sanctuary. Aliner looked toward the ancient paintings. For the first time, she understood why her family had protected the secret for so long. It was never about treasure. It was about remembering people whose stories had almost disappeared. Then a sudden sound echoed from the tunnel. More footsteps. Elias looked toward the entrance. They're not all with me. Lewis raised his weapon. Who else is coming? Elias's face became serious. The people who don't want the truth to survive. The lanterns in the tunnel multiplied. The chamber filled with approaching footsteps. Aliner closed the chest. The final secret had been discovered, but protecting it would be the hardest part of the entire journey. The footsteps grew louder. The lanterns moved closer through the tunnel, casting long shadows across the ancient paintings. Elias looked toward the entrance. We have minutes. Lewis quickly gathered the most important journals. Clark moved the remaining papers into a waterproof satchel. Aliner carefully held her grandfather's letter. Her grandmother stood beside the stone table. We cannot let them take the originals. Aliner looked at her. Then what do we do? Her grandmother pointed toward the far wall. There is another exit. Lewis followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed a narrow line running across the stone. Hidden doorway, the river. No, she shook her head. Something older suddenly spoke. The old trail. Everyone looked at him. He pointed toward the floor. There should be a passage beneath the table. Lewis and Clark moved the heavy stone table aside. Beneath it was a circular opening. Cold air rushed upward. Clark looked down. How deep? Deep enough, Elias replied. A loud crash came from the entrance. The hunters had reached the chamber. Now, Lewis helped Aliner descend. One by one, they disappeared into the opening. Elias remained behind. Lewis looked back. Come on. Elias shook his head. Someone has to close the door. You'll be trapped. Perhaps. He smiled faintly. I've spent half my life protecting this place. Aliner looked at him. You don't have to die for it. Stared at her. Your grandfather said the same thing. Then he pushed the stone table back into position. Lewis pulled Aliner down. The opening closed above them. Darkness surrounded them. For several moments they heard nothing. Then a deep rumble passed through the mountain. The passage had sealed. Aliner looked upward. Elias. Her grandmother placed a hand on her shoulder. He knew the risk. They continued downward. The tunnel became steeper. Water dripped from the ceiling. The air grew colder. Then they heard something unexpected. Music, very faint. A soft melody coming from somewhere ahead. Aliner stopped. Do you hear that? Lewis nodded. The sound seemed almost impossible. A gentle flute, slow, peaceful. As they moved forward, the passage opened into a small chamber. An old man sat beside a lantern. He was playing the flute. Aliner stared. Who are you? The man stopped playing. He looked at her. Name is Daniel. Her grandmother became pale. Daniel, he smiled. You remember me. Aliner looked between them. Who is he? Her grandmother answered quietly. Your grandfather's closest friend. Stood slowly. I was supposed to meet him here. Aliner's eyes filled with tears. He died. Shook his head. No, looked toward the sealed passage. He disappeared. Where did he go? Daniel looked at the old map. West. Lewis stepped forward. Why? To protect the final part of the records. Aliner's grandmother closed her eyes. There is another chamber. Nodded. The one even Margaret never entered. Aliner stared at him. Where is it? Daniel pointed toward the tunnel ahead. Beyond the river. Lewis unfolded the map. There was no route. No trail. Smiled. That is why no map can find it. Handed Lewis a small compass. Its needle did not point north. It pointed west toward the darkness. What does this lead to? Lewis asked. Daniel looked at Aliner. To the place where your grandfather has been waiting. Filled the chamber. Aliner could barely breathe. You mean? Nodded. He is alive. The words seemed to echo through the underground passage. After all these years, the mystery had taken another turn. Her father, her grandmother, the hidden chambers. And now her grandfather. Somewhere beyond the underground river, another secret waited. And this time the person who held the answer was not a stranger, he was family. The compass needle trembled in Lewis's hand. It pointed toward the darkness ahead. Alina stared at it. Grandfather is really there, Daniel nodded. He is still alive, yes. If Daniel's expression became serious. The underground river is dangerous. The passage changes when the water rises. Some paths disappear for months. Alina tightened her grip on the journal. Then we go now. Her grandmother looked at her. You don't have to. Yes, I do. She looked toward Lewis. I've spent my whole life wondering where my family went. Lewis nodded. Then we'll find them. They followed Daniel deeper into the mountain. The tunnel became narrower. The sound of water grew louder. Soon, they reached a wooden bridge suspended above a dark underground river. The bridge was old. Several boards were missing. Clark looked across it. I don't like this, smiled faintly. Neither did your ancestors. They crossed slowly. Halfway across, the mountain trembled. A wave of water rushed through the cavern below. The bridge shook violently. Alina lost her balance. Lewis caught her hand. For a moment, they stood close together. Are you all right? Yes, she looked into his eyes. Thank you. Lewis didn't let go immediately. Neither did she. The distant sound of water filled the cavern. Then Clark called from the other side. We should keep moving. They continued. At the end of the bridge was a stone door. Unlike the others, this one had no crescent symbol. Instead, it had two names carved into it. Samuel Lewis, Margaret Vale. Alina touched the names. Grandmother was here. Nodded. She never opened this door. It requires both families. Lewis examined the carving. There must be some kind of mechanism. Pointed toward two small depressions, one shaped like a crescent, the other shaped like a star. Alina took the silver key. Lewis searched his coat. Then he remembered the small silver coin. He removed it. The crescent symbol on the coin matched one of the depressions. Alina placed the key into the other. Together, they pressed them against the stone. Nothing happened. Then the mountain began to hum. A deep vibration moved through the floor. The stone door slowly opened. Warm golden light spilled into the tunnel. Everyone stopped. Beyond the doorway was a large chamber. But this chamber was different. There were no treasures, no gold, no maps, only a small house built inside the mountain. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Alina stared. Someone lives here. Smiled. I told you. They walked toward the house. The door opened before they reached it. An elderly man stood there. His hair was completely white. His face was thin, but his eyes were familiar. Alina stopped. She had seen those eyes in old family photographs. The man whispered, Alina. She could barely speak. Grandfather, he nodded. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Alina ran toward him. He held her tightly. I thought you were dead. I wanted you to believe that. It kept you safe. Alina pulled away. You left everyone. I know. Her grandfather looked at the old journal in her hand. I never stopped watching over you. Lewis stood nearby. The old man looked at him. You're the one? Lewis smiled. The one? The man who followed my granddaughter into the wilderness. Alina blushed slightly. Lewis laughed. I suppose that's true. Her grandfather smiled. Then perhaps the journey was worth it. Invited them inside. The small room was warm and peaceful. A fire burned in the stone fireplace. There were books everywhere. Maps covered the walls, and on a wooden table rested one final object, a golden box. Alina stared at it. What is that? Her grandfather looked toward the box. The treasure your family has protected for generations. Lewis stepped closer. It gold? The old man smiled. No. Open the box. Inside was a single folded document. Alina carefully lifted it. At the top was a date older than any record they had discovered, and beneath it was a name that made everyone in the room fall silent, because it belonged to the first person who had ever created the hidden network of chambers, the person who had started the entire mystery, and according to the document, that person had been waiting for them for more than a century. The room became completely silent. Alina looked at the document again. The name written across the top was unfamiliar. Jonathan Vale. Her grandfather watched her carefully. He was your family's first guardian. Alina frowned. Ancestor. Yes. Lewis leaned closer. What did he? Grandfather pointed toward the document. Read it. Alina unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was surprisingly clear. I came west searching for a route through the mountains. Instead, I found people who had already crossed them. They showed me rivers no map contained. They taught me trails that disappeared beneath snow. And they told me that knowledge should never belong to the person who discovers it. Alina paused. The words felt strangely familiar. She continued. So we created places where knowledge could remain safe, not treasures for kings, not riches for merchants, but memories for those who would come after us. Lewis looked around the chamber. These places were never built for treasure hunters. No, her grandfather replied. They were built for historians. Clark looked at the document. Then why hide everything? Her grandfather's expression became serious. Because there were people who wanted to erase the past. Eleanor looked up. Who? Men who believed history belonged to whoever had the power to write it. Lewis understood. The Black Crescent, her grandfather nodded. They have been searching for these records for generations. Why? To control the story. Eleanor looked at the document. Then the real treasure is the truth. Her grandfather smiled. Exactly. A soft silence followed, then Lewis noticed something. The document contained another symbol, a small star surrounded by 3 circles. What does that mean? Her grandfather looked at it. That is the final mark. Final? Yes. He reached beneath the table and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside was a collection of letters. These are the last records. Eleanor looked at him. Then why didn't you bring them out? Because I was waiting. What? For someone who understood why they mattered. Looked at Eleanor. You do now? She carefully gathered the letters. Her grandfather continued. But there is one problem. Lewis frowned. What? The chamber is no longer safe. Of the men outside, no, he pointed toward the ceiling. The mountain is changing. A distant rumble shook the room. Dust fell from the ceiling. Clark looked toward the doorway. What was that? The underground river is rising. Her grandfather quickly stood. We must leave. Eleanor looked around. What about the records? Take only what you can carry. They gathered the most important journals. Lewis took the ancient map. Eleanor held the final document. Her grandfather carried the remaining letters. They moved toward the exit, but before leaving, Eleanor stopped. She looked at the small house. You lived here alone all these years. Her grandfather smiled. Alone, pointed toward a shelf. There were dozens of small portraits, people who had lived in the hidden chambers. People who had protected the records, people who had disappeared from ordinary history. Eleanor understood this was not simply a hiding place. It was a home for forgotten stories. She touched one of the portraits. Will anyone remember them? Her grandfather looked at her. That is why you're here. They left the chamber. The underground river was already rising. Water rushed through the lower passage. Daniel shouted, "Move." They hurried across the stone bridge. Behind them, the chamber began filling with water. Eleanor looked back once. Her grandfather was walking beside her. For the first time in generations, the family was together. But as they reached the other side, a figure appeared in the darkness ahead. A black crescent was visible on his coat. Her grandfather stopped. Lewis raised his weapon. The stranger stepped into the light. He was holding a burning torch, and in his other hand was a letter. He looked directly at Eleanor. Your family has protected the truth for long enough. He raised the letter. Now the world will finally learn what is inside the final record. The torch touched the edge of the paper. Flames began to rise. And Eleanor realized that the greatest danger was no longer finding the treasure. It was saving the story before it disappeared forever. The flame touched the edge of the letter. Eleanor moved forward. Stop, the stranger smiled. You care about these old papers. They are people's lives. Then you should understand why they must disappear. He held the burning letter higher. Lewis stepped closer. Put it down, man laughed softly. You still think this is about gold? No, Lewis replied. I know exactly what this is about. Man's smile faded. Behind Eleanor, her grandfather whispered, his name is Nathaniel. Eleanor looked at him. Who is he? Blackwood's successor. Nathaniel slowly lowered the burning letter. Blackwood failed. He became obsessed with the treasure. But I understand its value, pointed toward the documents. The records could change the balance of power across the entire West. Lewis shook his head. They belong to history, Nathaniel smiled. History belongs to whoever controls it. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the tunnel. The mountain shook. Water burst through a narrow opening in the wall. Nathaniel stepped back. His men shouted from behind him. The river. Her grandfather looked at the ceiling. We have seconds. Eleanor held the final document tightly. Where do we go? Up, Daniel said. There is an old ventilation shaft. They hurried toward a narrow staircase carved into the rock. Water rushed behind them. Nathaniel followed. Nobody wanted to remain in the underground passage. They climbed higher, until the sound of the river became distant. Finally, they reached a small opening. Morning light appeared above them. One by one, they climbed out. They emerged on a mountain slope. The forest stretched endlessly below. Rain had stopped. The air was fresh and cold. Eleanor looked around. They were free. But Nathaniel was still there. He stood several yards away. His clothes were soaked. The burning letter was gone, but he still held another document. He looked at Eleanor. "You saved the records." She nodded, looked toward her grandfather. "You didn't save the secret." Her grandfather stared at him. "What secret?" Nathaniel smiled. "The final record has 2 pages. Eleanor's expression changed. She immediately opened the document. The first page contained the history, but the second page was missing. She looked at Nathaniel. "You have it," held up a folded sheet. "I found it years ago." Lewis stepped forward. "Give it to us." Nathaniel shook his head. "No, the second page reveals where the original treasure was taken." Stared at him. "Taken?" Nathaniel nodded. "The chamber was only a storage place." Her grandfather's face became pale. "What did you find?" Nathaniel looked toward the distant mountains. "The original records were moved before the first chamber was sealed." "Where?" Nathaniel smiled. "Somewhere even your family never searched." Lewis unfolded the ancient map. "Where?" Nathaniel pointed toward the far horizon, the place where the Missouri meets the Great Plains. Lewis became still. "That is where our journey began." "Yes." Eleanor looked at her grandfather. "Then the treasure was never really west." Her grandfather slowly nodded. "No, it was waiting at the beginning." Folded the missing page. "If you want it," he paused, "you'll have to follow me." Lewis stared at him. "You expect us to trust you?" "No." Daniel smiled. "You don't have to." He turned away. "I'll be waiting at the river." Then he disappeared into the forest. Eleanor stood silently. The mountains behind them were fading into mist. The river below continued toward the plains. Lewis looked at the old map. For the first time, the entire mystery seemed to connect. The hidden chambers, the families, the ancient records, the silver coin, the crescent symbol. And now the missing page. Everything was leading them back to where their journey had begun, the Missouri River. But this time they would not be traveling west. They would be following the trail home. And somewhere near the beginning of the great expedition, the oldest secret of all was waiting beneath the quiet plains. The journey back toward the Missouri began the following morning. The group traveled quietly through the forest. No one spoke much. Everyone was thinking about the same thing, the missing page, and the secret it contained. Eleanor rode beside her grandfather. For the first time in her life, she could ask him questions directly. "Why did you never tell me about the chambers?" He looked toward the trees. "Because secrets have a price." "Price? Sometimes the price is loneliness." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "You were lonely." "Yes." "It worth it?" Her grandfather thought for a moment. "When I see you now, I think perhaps it was." She smiled. Lewis watched them from ahead. He was glad to see the family finally together, but he could not forget Nathaniel. The man had disappeared too easily. There was something he wasn't telling them. That evening they camped beside a narrow stream. The fire burned low. Daniel studied the ancient map. "The Missouri is still several days away." Clark nodded. "And Nathaniel, he'll reach it before us." Lewis looked at the flames. "He wants us to follow him." Eleanor's grandfather nodded. "That's exactly what worries me." "Nathaniel doesn't need the treasure." Lewis looked at him. "He needs us." Followed. Eleanor understood. "Can't open the final chamber without someone from our families." "Exactly." She looked toward the dark forest. "Then we're walking into a trap." Her grandfather shook his head. "Perhaps." Lewis smiled slightly. "Or perhaps we're the ones setting the trap." Looked at him. He unfolded the ancient map. "There is another route." Clark leaned closer. "The old river trail." "Yes." Lewis pointed toward a narrow line. "We can reach the Missouri before Nathaniel does." Smiled. "Grandfather taught you well." Lewis looked at Eleanor. "Maybe." They decided to leave before dawn. The night remained quiet. Eleanor sat beside Lewis near the fire. "You think this is really the end?" Lewis looked at the stars. "I think we're getting close." She smiled. "Are you afraid?" "A little." "Good," he laughed. "Why?" "Because I am too." They sat together in silence. Then Eleanor reached for his hand. The gesture was small, but neither pulled away. The fire slowly burned lower. The forest whispered around them. And for a moment the danger seemed far away. At sunrise they continued. The landscape gradually opened. The mountains disappeared behind them. The forests became grasslands. The air became warmer. Then near sunset they saw it, the Missouri River, wide, slow, shining beneath the evening sky. Eleanor stopped her horse. "This is where it began." Lewis nodded. "Perhaps where it ends." They followed the river north. Near midnight they saw a light ahead, A single lantern beside the water. Nathaniel was waiting. He stood alone, no soldiers, no horses, only a small wooden boat. He raised one hand. "You came." Lewis approached carefully. "You knew we would," Nathaniel nodded. "You always follow the truth." Eleanor stepped forward. "Give us the missing page." Looked at her. "First, you must see something." Pointed across the river. On the opposite bank stood an old stone structure almost completely hidden beneath vines. Eleanor stared. "The final chamber." Nathaniel smiled. "No." Looked toward the dark water. "The beginning." "Push the boat into the river." "Come." Lewis looked at Eleanor, then at her grandfather. No one spoke. Finally, Eleanor stepped into the boat. Lewis followed. The others climbed aboard. Nathaniel began rowing. The Missouri moved beneath them. Moonlight reflected across the water. Halfway across, Eleanor noticed something beneath the surface. A faint silver glow. She leaned over the side. "What is that?" Nathaniel stopped rowing. Everyone looked down. The glow became brighter. Something was beneath the river, something large, something hidden for generations. Nathaniel smiled. The treasure was never under the mountain. He pointed into the dark water. It was here all along. Slowly, beneath the surface of the Missouri, the outline of an ancient stone structure began to appear. The stone structure rose slowly beneath the dark water. For a moment, nobody spoke. The moonlight revealed ancient walls beneath the surface, covered in moss and river silt. Eleanor stared. How could this be here? Nathaniel continued rowing. Because the river changed. Lewis looked at the map. The old map showed land here. "It was land once," Nathaniel replied. "The river swallowed it." Eleanor looked toward her grandfather. "You knew about this?" He shook his head. "Only the stories." "What stories?" "My grandfather spoke about a stone house that disappeared beneath the Missouri." Lewis looked at Nathaniel. "This is the lost settlement." Nathaniel nodded. "The first sanctuary." The boat drifted above the submerged structure. Then Nathaniel lowered a rope into the water. "We have to go down." Stared at him. "Into that?" Nathaniel smiled. "The entrance is still open." Eleanor looked at Lewis. "You don't have to come." He laughed softly. "After everything we've been through," she smiled. "Fair enough." They tied the boat to a nearby tree. Nathaniel led them to a small stone platform near the riverbank. Hidden beneath the mud was an iron ring. He pulled it. A circular stone door opened. Cold air rose from below. Eleanor held the lantern. A staircase descended beneath the river. They began walking. Water flowed through cracks in the stone. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. At last, they reached a large underground room. There were wooden shelves along the walls. Most had collapsed. But at the center stood a stone table. On it was a metal box. Eleanor approached. Nathaniel stopped her. "Wait." "Box is trapped." Lewis examined it. How? Nathaniel pointed toward the floor. Thin wires ran beneath the stone. One wrong movement and the entire chamber could collapse. Looked around. "Then how do we open it?" Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. "The same way your ancestors did." She looked at the box. There was a crescent symbol on top. She took out the silver key. Her grandfather stepped beside her. "There should be another symbol." They searched the box. Eleanor found it, a small star. Lewis removed the silver coin. The two symbols matched perfectly. Eleanor placed the key into the crescent. Lewis placed the coin against the star. Nothing happened. Then Eleanor remembered the inscription. "The truth shall belong to no single family." She placed her hand over Lewis's. Together they pressed both symbols. A deep click echoed through the room. The wires loosened. The stone floor remained still. The box opened. Inside was no gold. Instead, there was a collection of objects wrapped in cloth. Eleanor carefully opened the first, an ancient compass. The second contained a silver bracelet. The third held a small wooden carving. Then she found a leather pouch. Inside was a letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her grandfather's, but the date was from decades earlier. She looked at him. "You wrote this?" He shook his head. "No." She handed it to him. He read the first line. His face changed. "This isn't my handwriting." Lewis looked closer. "Then whose is it?" Her grandfather whispered, "Jonathan Vale." Eleanor unfolded the letter. "To the guardians who come after us. If you have reached the river chamber, then the mountain has already been opened. If you have found the final records, then the Black Crescent has already returned. Do not trust the person who brings you here." Eleanor slowly looked up. Everyone became silent. Her eyes moved toward Nathaniel. Nathaniel stood motionless. Lewis immediately stepped between them. "Nathaniel." Nathaniel did not answer. Eleanor held up the letter. "It says not to trust the person who brings us here." Nathaniel finally smiled. I wondered when you would find that. Her grandfather looked furious. You knew? Yes. Then why bring us here? Nathaniel looked toward the metal box. Because the letter has another page. Alina searched inside. There was nothing. Nathaniel reached into his coat. He removed the missing page. He placed it on the table. But before you read it, looked toward the ceiling. Water began dripping faster. The river is rising. A deep rumble shook the chamber. Nathaniel looked at Alina. You have 5 minutes to discover who the real traitor is. Somewhere behind them, the stone staircase began slowly filling with water. The water rose quickly. At first, it covered only the lowest steps. Then it reached the stone floor. Everyone moved toward the table. Alina unfolded the missing page. Her hands trembled. The writing was old but clear. The guardian must never be trusted completely. Not because he is evil, but because every guardian eventually becomes afraid. Alina stopped. She read the next line. Fear makes a person protect secrets even from those they love. Her grandfather looked at her. Keep reading. She continued. When the final chamber is opened, the guardian will have to choose, protect the secret or protect the people. Alina looked toward Nathaniel. You knew about this? Yes. You brought us here because you wanted someone to make the choice. Nathaniel nodded. Family protected these records for 3 generations. Looked at the rising water. We became prisoners of the secret. Lewis frowned. What do you want? Nathaniel pointed toward the metal box. Open the final compartment. Is another compartment? Nathaniel nodded. Alina examined the box. At the bottom was a small circular mark. She pressed it. A hidden section opened. Inside was a single golden key, not gold itself, just a key. Her grandfather stared at it. The final door. Nathaniel nodded. Exactly. Lewis looked at the map. There is no final door on this map. Because it isn't underground. Then where? Nathaniel looked toward the ceiling. Above us. Became silent. Alina understood the submerged structure. Yes, the ancient settlement beneath the Missouri had another entrance, one that led upward, but the river was rising. They had almost no time. Clark grabbed the ropes. We should go. Her grandfather took the golden key. I'll lead. Alina stopped him. No, looked at her. You've spent your entire life protecting this. She held his hand. You don't have to do it alone anymore. For a moment he said nothing. Then he smiled. Perhaps I don't. They began climbing. Water rushed behind them. Nathaniel stayed at the rear. Lewis followed closely beside Alina. The staircase became slippery. The water reached their knees, then their waists. They moved faster. At the top was a stone door. Her grandfather inserted the golden key. The lock turned. The door opened. A powerful current pulled everyone forward. They were swept into darkness. Alina felt Lewis's hand around hers. She held tightly. For several seconds there was only water, then she surfaced. Moonlight filled the river. She gasped for air. Lewis surfaced beside her. You all right? Yes. Across the water, Clark and Daniel were climbing onto the riverbank. Her grandfather followed, but Nathaniel was missing. Alina looked around. Nathaniel, no answer. Then something moved beneath the surface. Lewis dubbed. A few seconds later, he surfaced holding Nathaniel by the coat. They dragged him onto the shore. Nathaniel coughed violently. Alina knelt beside him. Why did you stay behind? He looked at her. To make sure everyone else escaped. Her grandfather stared at him. You finally chose the people, smiled weakly. Perhaps I finally understood the lesson. Alina looked toward the river. The submerged structure was disappearing beneath the water again. But the golden key remained in her grandfather's hand. And beyond the riverbank stood an ancient stone arch. Above it was a final inscription. Alina walked closer. The words were simple. The treasure belongs to those who remember. She looked at Lewis. The journey had brought them back to the beginning. But the true treasure was still waiting, not beneath the water, not inside the mountain, but behind the final door standing before them. Alina reached for the handle, and as the door began to open, a warm golden light spilled across the riverbank. The golden light grew brighter as the stone door opened. For a moment, Alina could see nothing beyond it. Then the light softened. A vast room appeared. Unlike the hidden chambers beneath the mountains, this place felt almost peaceful. There were no weapons, no traps, no piles of gold. Only shelves filled with carefully preserved journals, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Lewis slowly stepped inside. This is an archive. Her grandfather nodded. The oldest one. Alina walked between the shelves. Every journal had a name. Every name belonged to someone who had traveled through the wilderness. Some were explorers, some were traders, some were families. Some belonged to people whose names had never appeared in any official history. She touched one of the books. Why were all these stories hidden? Her grandfather answered quietly. Because the people who wrote them were afraid their stories would disappear. Eleanor looked around. And now someone can finally remember them. Lewis found a large wooden desk at the center of the room. On it was an empty book, beside it lay a pen, and above the desk was another inscription. Every journey changes the person who begins it. Write what you have learned. Eleanor smiled. I think this is what they wanted. Lewis looked at her. What? For someone to continue the story. Her grandfather slowly sat beside the desk. He seemed tired after all the years he had spent protecting the chamber. Eleanor placed her grandfather's letter beside him. You should write first. Looked at her. What should I say? The truth. He smiled. Then he picked up the pen. Outside, the river flowed quietly. The danger seemed far away. Even Nathaniel stood silently near the entrance. For the first time, nobody was searching for treasure. They were simply preserving memories. Hours passed. The lanterns burned low. Eleanor sat beside Lewis reading old journals. Occasionally, they exchanged quiet smiles. At one point, Lewis found a journal with a familiar name, Samuel Lewis. He opened it. Inside was a short entry. If my grandson ever finds this place, tell him that I never regretted choosing the wilderness. Lewis became quiet. Eleanor placed her hand over his. He looked at her. I wish I had known him. Perhaps you do now. He smiled. Yes. She leaned closer. The archive became silent around them. Only the soft turning of pages could be heard. Outside, dawn slowly approached. The first light of morning entered through a narrow opening in the stone. Eleanor looked toward the river. We should go home. Lewis nodded. But what happens to this place? Her grandfather closed his journal. It stays hidden. Forever. Not necessarily. Looked at the shelves. Perhaps one day, when the world is ready, someone will bring these stories into the light. Eleanor understood they would not take everything. They would not expose the sanctuary, but they would preserve the knowledge. They would tell the world that the wilderness had never been empty, that countless people had traveled its rivers, walked its mountains, named its valleys, and carried stories long before explorers arrived. Nathaniel approached them. I owe you an apology. Eleanor looked at him. For what? For believing that secrets were more important than people. Her grandfather stood. Then remember what you learned. Nathaniel nodded. I will. They prepared to leave. Eleanor took one final look at the archive. The journals remained on the shelves. The lanterns continued burning. The ancient walls stood silently around them. She realized that this was the greatest treasure they had found. Not gold, not jewels, not power, but thousands of forgotten lives waiting to be remembered. She took Lewis's hand. Together, they walked toward the doorway. Behind them, her grandfather remained for a moment. He looked at the empty book. Then he wrote one final sentence. The journey continues whenever someone chooses to remember. He closed the book. And as the morning sun rose above the Missouri River, the hidden door slowly closed behind them. But this time, the secret was no longer a burden. It was a promise that the stories would survive. The morning sun rose slowly above the Missouri. For the first time in many years, Eleanor's grandfather stood beneath an open sky without needing to hide. He watched the river for a long time. It looks different, he said. Eleanor smiled. Or perhaps you are seeing it differently. Looked at her. Perhaps. Lewis stood nearby, preparing the horses. The journey home would take several days, but nobody was in a hurry. They had spent years chasing secrets. Now they could simply travel. That afternoon, they followed the river south. The landscape was peaceful. Golden grass moved gently in the wind. Birds flew above the water. The distant mountains slowly disappeared behind them. Eleanor rode beside Lewis for a while. Neither spoke. Then she said, "Do you think we will ever stop exploring?" Lewis smiled. "Probably not," she laughed. "I was afraid you'd say that. You could always stay home." She looked at him. "And let you go alone?" "Absolutely not," she smiled. "Good." Their horses continued along the river. Behind them came her grandfather, Daniel, Clark, and Nathaniel. The old enemies no longer felt like enemies. Something had changed. Perhaps it was the discovery. Perhaps it was the shared danger. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that some battles were never really about winning. They were about deciding what deserved to survive. That evening, they camped beside a quiet meadow. Eleanor's grandfather sat near the fire. He looked older than he had inside the mountain. But he also seemed lighter. Eleanor sat beside him. "Are you going to stay with us?" He looked at her. If you'll have me, she smiled. I've been waiting my whole life. Took her hand. I am sorry, she shook her head. You came back. For a while they watched the fire together, then her grandfather reached into his coat. He removed a small envelope. This was your grandmother's. Alina opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Her grandmother stood beside a river many decades earlier. Beside her was a young man. Alina looked closely. She recognized him, her grandfather. She smiled. They were happy. Yes. Why didn't they stay together? Her grandfather looked toward the river. Protecting someone means leaving them. Became quiet, then she folded the photograph carefully. I don't want that kind of life. Her grandfather smiled. Neither do I. Across the fire, Louis heard the conversation. He looked at Alina, she looked back. There was something unspoken between them, something neither needed to explain. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, Alina walked toward the river. Louis followed. The moon reflected on the water. She stood quietly at the shore. It's strange. We spent so long looking for a treasure. Louis smiled. Found a family. She turned toward him, and perhaps something else. Louis stepped closer. Something else. Alina smiled. You know, laughed softly. I think I do. The river moved gently beside them. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Louis took her hand. They stood together beneath the moonlight. No maps, no danger, no hidden doors. Just the quiet river and the promise of another morning. But far away, beyond the campfire and the sleeping forest, something else was happening. Inside the hidden archive, a lantern had unexpectedly remained burning. And on the final desk, the empty book had opened by itself. A new line had appeared beneath the last sentence. 5 words. There is one chamber left. The secret was not over. The next morning, Alina found her grandfather standing beside the river. He was holding the old compass. Its needle was moving strangely. What's wrong? She asked. He turned. It started last night. Alina looked at the compass. The needle was not pointing west anymore. It was pointing directly toward the river. Her grandfather's expression became serious. Archive. Alina remembered the final words. There is one chamber left. Louis approached. What happened? Her grandfather showed him the compass. Louis studied it. Could it be reacting to the magnetic stone beneath the river? Perhaps. Alina looked at the water. We left something behind. Her grandfather nodded. The final chamber. Clark joined them. Another chamber. Her grandfather looked toward the horizon. Apparently, Nathaniel stood nearby. He had heard everything. I knew there was another. Alina turned sharply. You knew? I suspected. Why didn't you tell us? Because I didn't know where it was. Her grandfather looked at the compass. Now we do. Needle continued trembling, then slowly it pointed downstream. Alina unfolded the ancient map. There was one place they had overlooked, a small island, almost invisible on the old parchment. Louis pointed toward it. That island isn't on modern maps. Her grandfather nodded. Because it doesn't always exist. Do you mean? It disappears when the river rises. Alina looked at the current, and now the water is falling. They prepared immediately. A small boat was pushed into the river. Alina, Louis, her grandfather, and Nathaniel crossed first. The island appeared several miles downstream. First, it looked like nothing more than a stretch of wet sand. Then Alina noticed something beneath the trees, stone steps. They climbed from the riverbank into the forest. Louis cleared away the vines. A circular stone entrance appeared. No crescent, no star, no keyhole, only one sentence. The last chamber has no guardian. Alina stared. What does that mean? Her grandfather slowly shook his head. I don't know. Looked uneasy. For the first time, neither do I. They entered. The passage was surprisingly short. At the end was a small room. There was no treasure, no archive, no paintings, only a chair, and on the chair lay a sealed letter. Alina picked it up. The seal carried a symbol she had never seen before. A simple river flowing beneath a star. She opened it. The first line made her stop. To the final descendants of the Guardians. Louis leaned closer. She continued reading. You have searched for treasure because you believed something was missing. But nothing was missing. The treasure was never hidden. It was divided. Alina looked up. Divided. Her grandfather nodded. She read on. One part was placed in the mountains, one beneath the river, one inside the archive, and the final part was carried by the people themselves. Louis understood. The people are the treasure. Her grandfather smiled. The stories. Alina continued. No chamber can protect a story forever. Only those who remember can do that. She lowered the letter. For a moment, everyone was silent. Then Alina noticed something at the bottom of the page. A final sentence. Your journey ends when you understand that you were never searching for what was lost. You were searching for what was already with you. She looked at Lewis. He smiled. The mystery had finally made sense. All those years, all those journeys, all those hidden chambers, they had been leading toward one simple truth. The treasure was not something they could possess. It was something they could carry forward. Alina folded the letter. Then she noticed a small wooden box beneath the chair. Inside was the silver coin. Same coin Lewis had carried from the beginning. But now something had changed. A tiny inscription had appeared around its edge. Alina held it beneath the sunlight. The words became visible, remember. Then continue, she smiled. Lewis looked at her. I think we found the last treasure. Alina closed her fingers around the coin. No, she looked toward the river. I think we finally understood it. Outside, the Missouri flowed quietly toward the horizon. And for the first time, the compass needle became completely still. It pointed nowhere, because there was nowhere left to search. For the first time since the journey began, the compass needle remained perfectly still. Alina held it in her palm. She almost expected it to move again. It did not. Lewis smiled. Maybe it has finally found its home. Alina looked at the compass. Or maybe it never needed to point anywhere. Her grandfather nodded. That is what Jonathan wanted us to understand. They left the small chamber and returned to the river. The island was already beginning to disappear beneath the rising water. They climbed into the boat. As they moved away, Alina looked back. Within minutes, the stone steps vanished beneath the river. The final chamber disappeared again. But this time, Alina wasn't afraid. The secret was safe. And the story was no longer trapped underground. They traveled slowly toward home. Days passed. The wilderness became familiar. The great forests opened into wide grasslands. The rivers became calmer and the nights became warmer. One evening they stopped beside a field of tall grass. The sunset painted the horizon. Alina sat beside Lewis. She held the silver coin. You remember when we first found this? Lewis smiled. It nearly got us killed. Yet you kept it. I had a feeling it mattered. She looked at him. You always did. He laughed. Not always. She rested her head against his shoulder. The wind moved softly through the grass. There was no need for words. The journey had changed them. They had entered the wilderness searching for something mysterious. They had returned carrying something much more valuable, a deeper understanding of the land, a family reunited, and a love that had quietly grown between two people who had never expected to find it. Several weeks later, they reached a small settlement. People gathered around them. They wanted to hear stories about the expedition. Lewis spoke about the rivers. Clark spoke about the mountains. Daniel spoke about the hidden trails. Nathaniel remained quiet, and Alina listened. She realized that every person remembered the journey differently. That was the beauty of history. It was never only one story. It was thousands of voices, thousands of memories, thousands of lives. That night, Alina opened a fresh journal. She began writing, not about gold, not about secret chambers, not about Nathaniel. She wrote about the people they had met, the families who had guided travelers, the communities who knew the rivers, the forgotten guardians, the old maps, the hidden archive, and the promise that no story should disappear simply because no one had written it down. Lewis watched her write. What will you call it? She thought for a moment. The river that remembered. He smiled. I like it. She continued writing. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. The sound reminded her of the night they first discovered the hidden map. So much had changed since then. Yet the rain sounded exactly the same years later. People would remember the great expedition. They would remember the names of Lewis and Clark. They would remember the rivers and mountains. They would remember the maps. But very few would know the secret story behind them. That was intentional. The hidden chambers remained protected. The original records stayed where they belonged. Only copies of the most important histories were shared, and the descendants of the guardians continued the promise. Whenever someone asked Alina about the treasure, she would smile. What treasure? They would laugh. But she knew the answer. The treasure was the story. The treasure was memory. The treasure was love. And perhaps most importantly, the treasure was the knowledge that the wilderness had never been empty. It had always been full of voices, some loud, some quiet, some forgotten, but never truly gone. One autumn evening, many years after the expedition, Alina returned to the Missouri. She was older now. The river looked almost exactly as it had on the night of their first journey. She sat beneath a tree. Beside her was the old journal, and beside the journal was the silver coin. Lewis came walking toward her. His hair had begun to turn gray. He smiled. "You came here without me," she laughed. "I knew you'd find me." He sat beside her. For a while they watched the river. Then Alina opened the journal. The final page was blank. She looked at Lewis. "Do you know what I should write?" He shook his head. "What?" She smiled. "Nothing." She closed the book. Some stories should be left open. The river moved quietly beneath the evening sky, and somewhere beneath those waters, beneath the mountains, and beneath forgotten forests, the old chambers remained silent, waiting not for treasure hunters, not for kings, but for someone who would come searching not for gold but for a story. And perhaps one day another traveler would follow the river. They would find the same strange compass, the same silver coin, the same hidden symbols. And the wilderness would whisper the same ancient lesson. Some treasures are not meant to be found. They are meant to be remembered. The following spring, something unexpected arrived at Alina's home. It was a small wooden parcel. There was no return address, no name, only the familiar symbol of a river beneath a star. Alina stared at it for several moments before calling Lewis. "I think our past has found us again." Lewis entered the room and looked at the parcel. "That symbol." "Yes." Carefully opened the lid. Inside was an old leather notebook. The cover was badly worn, but the pages were remarkably preserved. Alina opened the first page. There was a single sentence: "If you have found this book, then the Guardians failed to keep one final secret hidden." Lewis looked at her. "Final secret." Alina continued reading. The records beneath the Missouri were not the beginning. They were not the end. They were only one chapter. Her fingers stopped. Beneath the writing was a rough drawing of the American continent, but the map was much larger than anything they had seen before. It stretched beyond the familiar rivers and mountains. Far to the north was another symbol, far to the west was another, and near the southern edge was a third. 3 hidden places, 3 unknown chambers, 3 ancient marks. Lewis slowly sat down. "I thought there was only one remaining chamber." Alina smiled faintly. "So did I." She turned another page. This time there was a list of names. Some belonged to people they knew, others were completely unfamiliar. At the bottom was a name written in darker ink, Jonathan Vale. Beside it was a date from shortly before he disappeared. Alina stared at it. "This means he knew about these places." Lewis nodded. "And he left them for someone. In our family, perhaps." Alina looked toward the window. Outside, spring rain had begun falling. The sound was gentle, almost peaceful. But beneath that peaceful sound was the quiet feeling of another journey waiting. Lewis reached for the notebook. "There may be no reason to follow this." Alina looked at him. "You don't believe that?" He smiled. "No." She closed the notebook. "Neither do I." They sat together beside the window. For a while they simply listened to the rain. There was no urgency, no danger, no need to leave tomorrow. The wilderness had taught them patience. Some mysteries could wait. Some stories needed time. And perhaps the greatest secret was not where the next chamber was located. Perhaps it was who had written the notebook. Because on the final page, beneath all the maps and symbols, was a short message. Only 4 words: "I'm still watching." Alina read it twice. Then she looked at Lewis. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain continued falling. Far beyond the window, the Missouri carried its ancient waters toward the horizon. And somewhere beyond the familiar world, hidden beneath forests, mountains, and forgotten rivers, another story was quietly waiting to be discovered. The notebook remained on the table for several days. Alina did not open it again, not because she was afraid, because she wanted to understand what the message meant before beginning another search. "I'm still watching." Those 4 words stayed in her thoughts. One evening, Lewis returned from the river carrying a small bundle. "I found something." Looked up. "What?" He placed the bundle on the table. Inside was an old brass button. Alina immediately recognized the symbol engraved upon it, the black crescent. Her expression changed. "Where did you find this?" "Near the old river crossing." "That place is miles away." "I know." She picked up the button. There was dried mud around its edge, but beneath the mud was something else. A tiny inscription. She cleaned it carefully. 3 letters appeared. MV. Alina stared. "Margaret Vale." Lewis nodded. "Your grandmother never wore anything with the black crescent." "No." Alina turned the button over. A small number had been carved into the back. 17. She opened the notebook. There was a page numbered 17. The page had been folded inward. Alina slowly opened it. A short entry was written there. The first guardian is not always the first person to know. Sometimes the truth reaches a family through love. Alina read the sentence again. Through love, Lewis looked at her. Maybe it isn't talking about romantic love. Maybe. She turned the page. A name appeared, Margaret and Samuel. Below it was a date. The same year her grandparents had first met. Alina smiled. Grandmother never told me how they met. Lewis leaned closer. Maybe this notebook will. She continued reading. The entry described a rainy evening beside the Missouri. Margaret had been traveling alone when she found an injured young man near the river. She stopped to help him. That young man was Samuel. He had been carrying a small wooden box. Inside the box was the first map. But the map was incomplete. Margaret helped him recover, and together they discovered the first hidden chamber. Alina looked at the page. The treasure hunt began with them meeting. Lewis smiled. With explorers. With two people, she nodded. Two people who happened to find each other. The story suddenly felt different. The hidden chambers were no longer just places. They were connected to people, friendships, families, promises, and perhaps love. Alina turned another page. A sentence had been underlined. Never search for the chamber without remembering the person who showed you the way. She looked at Lewis. That sounds like a warning or advice. If every chamber was discovered because someone trusted someone else, Lewis thought for a moment. Then maybe the real map isn't made of rivers. Alina smiled. It's made of people. For the first time, the mystery felt peaceful again. Not like a dangerous secret, more like a family story that had been waiting patiently to be understood. Then Alina noticed something beneath the notebook. A second envelope. She had never seen it before. There was no symbol on it, only her name. Alina. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph. She looked at it. Her heart suddenly stopped. It showed her grandmother, Margaret, standing beside the Missouri. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a young man Alina had never seen before. And behind them, barely visible among the trees, was a third person. A man wearing a black crescent. On the back of the photograph was a sentence. This is the man who watched your family before Blackwood ever existed. Alina slowly lowered the photograph. Lewis looked at her. Who is he? She shook her head. I don't know. Then she turned the photograph over once more. At the very bottom was a location, not a mountain, not a river, a small town, a town where Alina had never been. And beneath the name of that town were 5 quiet words. He is waiting there now. The town was called Bellwater. Alina had never heard the name before. It was a small settlement far from the main roads, surrounded by forests and open fields. The next morning, she showed the photograph to her grandfather. His face changed immediately. Where did you get this? It was inside the notebook. He took the photograph carefully. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he whispered, I know that man. Alina's heart began beating faster. Who is he? Her grandfather looked toward the window. His name was Arthur Bell. Yes, you knew him. Your grandmother did. Alina looked at the photograph again. What happened to him? He disappeared. Like everyone else. Her grandfather smiled sadly. Not exactly. He turned the photograph over. Bellwater was his home. Lewis entered the room. What are you talking about? Her grandfather handed him the photograph. Lewis studied it. Bell recognized the name from one of the old journals. He was a guide. Her grandfather nodded. More than a guide. What was he? A guardian. Alina looked at him. Then why was he wearing the black crescent? Her grandfather became silent. That symbol didn't always mean what it means now. Do you mean the first guardians used it to identify one another? Alina frowned. The people we thought were enemies. Some of them may have been guardians. Lewis looked at the notebook. Then someone changed the meaning of the symbol. Her grandfather nodded. Over time, a few guardians became obsessed with power. They turned against the others. The black crescent became a symbol of fear. Alina slowly understood. The organization Nathaniel spoke about was once something different. A group of protectors. Yes, she looked at the photograph. Then Arthur may not be our enemy. No, her grandfather pointed toward the man's face. May be the person who knows why everything changed. They left for Bellwater 2 days later. The journey was peaceful. Spring had returned to the countryside. Wildflowers appeared beside the road. Birds moved between the trees. For the first time, the journey felt almost like an ordinary trip. Alina rode beside Lewis. You know, she said, we could simply stay home. Lewis laughed. You don't believe that. No, neither do I, she smiled. The road curved through a forest. By sunset they saw the first houses of Bellwater. It was smaller than Alina expected. A few wooden buildings, a quiet inn, a blacksmith, and a small church overlooking the river. They stopped at the inn. The owner looked at the photograph. His expression changed. "You're looking for Arthur?" Alina nodded. "Do you know him?" The man lowered his voice. "Everyone here knows him." "Can we find him?" The innkeeper looked toward the church. "They're after dark." "Why after dark?" "He doesn't like visitors during the day." Lewis exchanged a glance with Alina. That night they walked toward the church. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The river moved quietly beside the road. As they approached the churchyard, Alina noticed a figure standing beneath an old tree, an elderly man, tall, thin. His hair was completely white. He held a lantern. Alina stopped. The man looked at her, then at the photograph in her hand. "You look exactly like Margaret," whispered Arthur. The man nodded. "I wondered how long it would take." Lewis stepped forward. "You've been waiting for us." Arthur smiled. "For your family, yes." Looked toward the river. "Your grandmother promised she would send someone one day." Alina's voice trembled. "Why didn't she come herself?" Arthur's expression softened. "She did." Alina froze. "When?" Arthur looked directly at her. "The last time I saw Margaret, she was carrying a child." Alina's eyes widened. "Her child?" Arthur nodded. "Your father." The old man stepped closer. "And she wasn't running from the guardians. She was running from someone inside her own family." Wind moved through the trees. Alina looked at Lewis, then back at Arthur. "Who?" Arthur lowered the lantern. "Your grandfather's brother." A silence fell over the churchyard. Her grandfather had always said there was only one guardian in the family, but now another name had appeared, another secret. And Arthur had one final warning. If you want to understand the Black Crescent, you must first learn what happened to the man who wore it before anyone else. Arthur led them through the quiet churchyard. The moon finally appeared between the clouds. He stopped beside an old stone monument covered in moss. This is where the story changed. Alina looked at the inscription. There was only one name, Samuel Lewis. Her grandfather stared at it. "Grandfather?" Arthur nodded. "He wasn't the only guardian." Alina frowned. "You said his brother was involved." "He was." "What was his name?" Arthur looked toward the river. "Thomas." Her grandfather became silent. "Thomas Lewis." Lewis stepped closer. "Was he the man who betrayed the guardians?" Arthur shook his head. "Then what happened?" Arthur sighed. "Thomas believed the guardians were hiding too much." Alina listened carefully. "He believed the records should be shared." "That sounds reasonable." "It was at first." Looked at her. "Then powerful men discovered what the records contained. They offered Thomas money. He accepted?" "No." "Then why did he disappear?" Arthur's eyes became sad. "Because he discovered something that frightened him." "What?" "A map." Lewis looked at the river. "The same map we've been searching for." Arthur nodded. "It wasn't a map of the wilderness." "Then what was it?" "A map of the guardians." Alina stared. "People." "Exactly." Arthur explained that the old network had spread across the continent. Guardians lived in settlements, trading posts, villages, and remote cabins. They watched over the records. They protected travelers. They carried messages. But the map revealed every guardian's location. If it fell into the wrong hands, the entire network could be destroyed. Thomas took the map and disappeared. "He was trying to protect them," Alina said. "Yes." "Then why did my grandmother run from him?" Arthur looked at her. "She didn't." Alina's expression changed. "Then who did she run from?" "Her own father." "My great-grandfather." Arthur nodded. "He believed the map should be destroyed. He thought the only way to protect the guardians was to erase them completely." Slowly understood. "That is why the family kept disappearing." Arthur nodded. "Every generation made the same choice. Hide, run, protect. But eventually someone always returned." Alina looked at Lewis, and now Arthur smiled. "Now you have a choice. Choice: continue hiding, or finally tell the truth." The river flowed quietly behind them. Lewis looked at Alina. She looked at the old church, then at Arthur. "What happened to Thomas?" Arthur hesitated. "He left Bellwater more than 40 years ago." "Where did he go?" Arthur pointed toward the forest. "To the house beside the old cedar." Alina remembered the photograph. "Is he alive?" Arthur smiled. "If the stories are true," he paused. "He should be." Alina's heart began beating faster. Another missing guardian, another family secret, another road waiting to be followed. She looked at Lewis. "Tomorrow," he smiled. "Tomorrow." Arthur handed Alina a small brass key. She looked at it. "What does this open?" Arthur answered quietly. "Thomas's house." Then he turned toward the river. Be careful. Why? Arthur looked back, because Thomas wasn't the only person who disappeared there. Somewhere beyond the dark forest, a single lantern appeared beside an abandoned house. The lantern remained visible between the trees. Alina held the brass key tightly. Arthur stayed behind. You won't come with us? She asked. He shook his head. Some doors must be opened by the people who inherit the story. Lewis looked toward the forest. Then we'll go. They followed the narrow trail. The woods were unusually quiet. Only the sound of their footsteps and the distant river accompanied them. After nearly an hour, they reached the old cedar. Beyond it stood a small wooden house. The windows were dark. The door was covered with vines. Alina inserted the brass key. The lock turned immediately. Inside, everything looked untouched. A wooden chair, a cold fireplace, old books, and photographs covering the walls. Alina walked slowly through the room. Then she stopped. One photograph showed her grandmother as a young woman. Beside her stood Thomas, and between them was a baby. Alina stared. That is my father. Lewis came closer. He must have been very young. She nodded. On the back of the photograph was a date. The same year her father disappeared from the family records. Alina's voice became quiet. Why was this hidden? A floorboard creaked behind them. They turned. An elderly man stood in the doorway. He held a lantern. His hair was white. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp. Alina knew immediately. Thomas. The old man stared at her, then his expression softened. You have Margaret's eyes. Alina stepped forward. You knew my grandmother. I loved her like a sister. Then why did you disappear? Thomas looked toward the photographs. Because I was trying to keep your father alive. Alina froze. Alive? Thomas nodded. Your father was never lost. Then where is he? Thomas looked at the old clock on the wall. He left this house many years ago. Where? West. Alina felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. Is he alive? Thomas smiled faintly. He was when I last heard from him. When was that? 3 years ago. Alina could barely breathe. You knew. I wanted to tell your grandfather. Why didn't you? Thomas looked down. Because someone was watching me. Lewis immediately became alert. Who? Thomas walked to the window. The same people who have been following your family for generations. Alina looked at the black crescent photograph. Are they still after us? Thomas nodded. They never stopped. Opened a hidden drawer beneath the table. Inside was a collection of letters. All of these came from your father. Alina reached for them. Her hands trembled. She opened the first letter. Dear mother, if this reaches you, please tell Alina that I never forgot her. Alina stopped reading. Tears filled her eyes. Lewis stood quietly beside her. She continued. I left because I believed staying would put everyone in danger. But I have spent my life trying to finish what our family began. The last chamber is not a place. It is a person. Alina looked up. What does that mean? Thomas whispered. That's the question your father wanted you to answer. She opened another letter. This one contained a location, a small village far to the west. And below it were 4 words, come when you are ready. Alina closed her eyes. Her father was alive, somewhere beyond the western horizon. After everything they had discovered, the greatest mystery was no longer the treasure. It was her own family. Lewis gently touched her shoulder. We'll find him. Alina looked at him. You promise? He smiled. I don't make promises lightly. She smiled through her tears. Then I believe you. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar branches. Thomas closed the door, but before they could leave, he noticed something on the floor, a fresh footprint. Someone had been inside the house recently, and whoever it was had been waiting for them. Thomas stared at the footprint. It wasn't there yesterday. Lewis immediately moved toward the window. The forest outside was completely still. No movement, no birds, nothing. Alina held the letters against her chest. Someone followed us, nodded, and they know where your father is. A faint sound came from outside, a branch snapping, then another. Lewis raised his hand. Stay here. Stepped toward the door. Thomas stopped him. Don't. Whoever is outside wants us to chase them. Lewis paused. Thomas pointed toward the floor. There was another footprint, then another. They formed a trail leading toward the back of the house. But the footprints were strange. They stopped at the wall. Alina looked confused. How can someone walk through a wall? Thomas smiled sadly. They didn't. Moved an old bookshelf. Behind it was a narrow opening, a hidden passage. Lewis looked at him. You knew this was here. Nodded. Your family built it. They entered. The passage descended beneath the house. After several minutes, it opened into a small underground room. There was a table, a lantern, and a chair. Someone had recently been sitting there. On the table was a fresh cup of tea, still warm. Alina whispered they were waiting. Walked toward the table. Beside the cup was a folded note. He opened it. His face changed. "What does it say?" Alina asked. Thomas handed it to her. Only one sentence was written. "Tell Alina the Western Road is a lie." She looked at Thomas. "What does that mean?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." Lewis examined the paper. "There is something else." Turned it over. A small symbol had been drawn on the back, not the crescent, not the star, a simple circle with a line through it. Thomas became pale. "I haven't seen that symbol in 40 years. What is it?" "The first Guardians used it before the Black Crescent." Alina looked at the note again. "Then whoever left this is older than the organization." Nodded. "Much older." A low sound suddenly echoed through the passage. Someone was moving above them. Lewis extinguished the lantern. Everyone became silent. Footsteps crossed the floor overhead slowly, carefully. Then the footsteps stopped. A voice whispered from above. Alina, she froze. She knew that voice. It was impossible. Her heart began racing. "Dad," no answer. Lewis looked at her. Thomas raised a finger to his lips. Then the voice came again. "Alina, don't trust Thomas." Closed his eyes. Alina stared at him. "What is happening?" Thomas whispered. "He found us." "Who?" Thomas looked toward the ceiling. "Your father." The room became silent. Alina could barely breathe. Her father was alive. He was standing somewhere above them. But why had he warned her not to trust Thomas? The footsteps moved away. Alina rushed toward the stairs. Thomas grabbed her arm. "Wait." She looked at him. "I've waited my entire life." Thomas slowly released her. "Then go." Climbed the stairs. The upper room was empty. The front door stood open. Rain had begun falling outside. On the wooden floor was one final object, a small photograph. Lena picked it up. It showed her father standing beside the Missouri River. He looked older, but he was smiling. On the back was a handwritten message: "If you truly want the truth, follow the river north." Alina looked outside. The rain became heavier. Lewis stood beside her. "North," she nodded. Thomas appeared behind them. "I know where that river leads." Alina turned. "Where?" Thomas looked toward the dark horizon. "To the place where the first Guardian disappeared." He paused. "Where your father has been waiting all these years." They left Thomas's house before sunrise. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest covered in silver droplets. Thomas rode with them. For the first time, Alina felt that the old Guardian was no longer hiding anything. Or at least she hoped he wasn't. They followed the river north. The current moved steadily beside the trail. After several hours, Thomas pointed toward a distant ridge. "Beyond those hills is the old settlement." "What settlement?" Alina asked. "The first one." Lewis looked at him. "You mean the place where the Guardians began?" Thomas nodded. "It was abandoned more than a century ago." "Why?" Thomas remained silent for a moment. "Because everyone disappeared." Alina felt a chill. Everyone. Evening approached. They reached the ridge. Below them was a small valley. Ruined houses stood among tall grass. An old wooden bridge crossed the river. And near the center of the settlement stood a stone building. Its roof had collapsed, but one window still had a light behind it. Alina stopped. "Someone is inside." Nodded. "Your father." They rode down the hill. Alina's heart was beating faster with every step. The door of the stone building opened. A man stood in the doorway. He was older than Alina remembered from the photographs. His hair was dark gray. His face carried years of exhaustion, but his eyes were unmistakable. Alina whispered, "Dad." The man looked at her for several seconds. He could not speak. Then he stepped forward. "Alina." She ran to him. He held her tightly. "I thought you were gone. I thought you were dead. I wanted you to believe that." She pulled away. "Why?" "Because I needed you to live without being followed." Her eyes filled with tears. "You could have come home. I tried." "Then why didn't you?" He looked toward Thomas. "Because of him." Lowered his head. Alina turned. "What did he do?" Her father shook his head. "Nothing." "Then why blame him?" "Because he knew the truth." Finally spoke. "I was protecting your mother." Her father looked at him. "And I was protecting Alina." Lewis stepped between them. "Maybe both of you were trying to protect the same family." Alina looked at her father. "What truth?" He slowly walked toward the stone table. On it was a large map, not a map of the wilderness. A map of the Guardians. Every mark represented a family. Every line represented a secret route, and one mark was different. It was located far beyond the known settlements. Her father pointed to it. "This is the place where the first Guardian disappeared." Stared. "Jonathan Vale." Her father nodded. "He didn't disappear. Happened. He discovered something beneath the settlement." Chamber. "No." Her father looked directly at Alina. "A person." Alina frowned. Who? Her father placed a small photograph on the table. The photograph showed an elderly woman. Eleanor had never seen her before. Her father whispered, "Your great-great-grandmother." Eleanor froze. She died before Jonathan disappeared. That is what the family records say. Then how can she be here? Her father looked toward the river. Because she was the one who created the first Guardian network. Nodded. And she never died here. Eleanor looked at the photograph. Where did she go? Her father pointed toward the northern forest. She crossed the river. Disappeared. Lewis studied the map. There is no trail. Her father smiled. That is why nobody has found her. Eleanor stepped closer. Then what are we waiting for? Her father looked at her. For the river to reveal the path. Outside, the water suddenly began moving in an unusual direction. The current reversed. The river slowly pulled away from the shore. And beneath the water, an ancient stone pathway began to appear, a path that had been hidden for generations. Eleanor looked at Lewis. The journey was beginning again. But this time they were not searching for a lost treasure. They were searching for the woman who had started everything. The ancient pathway slowly emerged from the river. Stone by stone, it appeared beneath the fading light. No one spoke. Even the river seemed to become quiet. Eleanor's father stepped closer to the shore. This path only appears when the water reaches its lowest point. Nodded. I saw it once when I was young. You follow it? No. Your great-great-grandmother left a warning. Pointed toward the first stone. Eleanor walked closer. Carved into the stone were several words. Only those who carry no desire for treasure may cross. Eleanor smiled softly. I think we're safe. Lewis laughed. After everything we've found, I certainly don't want gold. Her father looked at Eleanor. Then perhaps the path will accept you. They began crossing. The stones were slippery. Mist floated above the river. With every step, the mainland seemed farther away. Halfway across, Eleanor noticed something beneath the water. A row of old lanterns, still hanging from iron hooks. How old are those? Her father answered, older than the settlement. Who placed them there? The first guardians. They continued. At the end of the path stood a narrow wooden door built into the riverbank. There was no lock. Eleanor pushed it gently. It opened. Beyond it was a small tunnel. The walls were covered with paintings, families, travelers, children, people standing beside rivers and mountains. At the end of the tunnel was a room filled with sunlight. Eleanor stopped. Someone was sitting beside a window, an elderly woman. Her hair was completely white. She was holding a book. Slowly, she looked up. Eleanor's father whispered, "Mother." The woman smiled. It's been a long time. Eleanor could barely breathe. Her great-great-grandmother was alive. The old woman looked at Eleanor. You have your grandmother's eyes. Eleanor stepped forward. How? The woman smiled. Some stories refused to end. She closed the book. The guardians thought I disappeared. I wanted them to believe I was gone. Her father looked hurt. You let us believe you were dead. I let you believe I was somewhere you couldn't reach. Eleanor sat beside her. Why did you hide? The old woman looked toward the river. Because the greatest danger was never the people hunting the treasure. What was it? People who believed they owned the truth. She opened the book. Inside were pages filled with names, every guardian, every family, every secret route. Then she turned to the final page. There was only one sentence. The story must never belong to one generation. Eleanor understood. That is why the chambers were created. Yes. That is why the treasure was divided. Yes. And that is why our family kept searching. The old woman smiled, searching, remembering. Outside, the evening sky began turning gold. Eleanor looked at her family, her father, her grandfather, Thomas, Lewis. For the first time, the entire story seemed complete. The treasure had never been a chest of gold. It had been a chain of memories passed from one generation to another. A chain that had nearly broken many times, but had survived. The old woman reached into her pocket and removed a small silver pendant. She gave it to Eleanor. This belonged to the first guardian. Eleanor looked at it. The familiar river and star symbol was engraved on the front. What should I do with it? The old woman smiled. Give it to someone you trust. Eleanor looked at Lewis. He understood immediately. She placed the pendant in his hand. For a moment their eyes met. No words were necessary. The old woman smiled. Now the story can continue. Outside, the river began flowing normally again. The hidden pathway slowly disappeared beneath the water. And as darkness settled over the valley, Eleanor finally understood the oldest lesson of the Guardians. A treasure can be buried. A map can be lost. A door can be hidden. but a story carried in the hearts of people can travel farther than any river. And sometimes the greatest adventure is not discovering something new. It is finding your way back to the people you thought you had lost forever. The old woman remained by the window as night slowly settled over the hidden chamber. The lantern beside her cast a soft golden glow across the room. Eleanor sat quietly nearby, still holding the silver pendant. For the first time she felt that there were no unanswered questions left. But then the old woman looked toward the door. Not quite. Eleanor turned. Old woman smiled. There is still one story you haven't heard. Father became serious. Mother, she raised her hand. It is time. She opened the old book again. Near the back was a page covered with faded handwriting. This was written by Jonathan Vale. Eleanor leaned closer. The old woman began reading. If one day the Guardians are reunited, they must understand that the greatest danger will not come from outside. It will come from the desire to possess what they protect. Eleanor looked at Lewis. The words seemed familiar. The same lesson had appeared in almost every chamber. The old woman continued. When the Guardians forget that the stories belong to everyone, the network will begin to fall apart. And when that happens, the Black Crescent will return. Eleanor's expression changed. The Black Crescent, her father nodded. It was never completely gone. The old woman closed the book. It has simply been waiting. A cold silence filled the room. Lewis stood. Where? The old woman looked toward the northern forest. Everywhere. That isn't an answer. No, she smiled. It is a warning. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Then Eleanor heard something, a faint sound, a horse. Then another. Her father stood immediately. They found us. Reached for his coat. How many? Enough. Lewis looked toward the old woman. Can we defend this place? She shook her head. You don't need to. Then what do we do? Leave. Eleanor looked confused. Leave the chamber. Yes. But the records, they have already been copied. Her father smiled. Your grandmother made sure of that. The old woman stood slowly. She walked to a hidden section of the wall and pressed her hand against a stone. A doorway opened. Beyond it was another narrow passage. This will take you to the western ridge. Eleanor looked back at the chamber. You're coming with us. The old woman smiled. I have been hiding long enough. She took Eleanor's hand. Perhaps it is time to see the world again. They entered the passage. Behind them, distant voices echoed through the hidden chamber. Someone had entered the building, but the Guardians were already gone. They climbed through the narrow tunnel until they reached the surface. The night air was cold. Stars filled the sky. Below them, the valley stretched toward the river. Eleanor looked back. The hidden entrance disappeared beneath the earth. Her father stood beside her. For the first time, he said, "We don't have to run." She looked at him. "Where do we go?" He smiled. "Home." Lewis approached. After that, Eleanor looked toward the distant horizon. She thought about the maps, the journals, the hidden chambers, the people whose stories had been forgotten. Then she smiled. "After that, we write everything down." Lewis laughed softly. "That's a very dangerous plan. Once a story is written, people will start searching for it." Eleanor looked at the silver pendant. "Then we'll make sure they search for the right reason." They began walking down the ridge. Behind them, the old woman watched the stars. The Guardians had survived. The secret had survived. But perhaps the greatest change had already happened. The story was no longer being carried by a few frightened people hiding in the wilderness. It was ready to be carried by a new generation. And somewhere far away, beneath the quiet Missouri River, an ancient lantern suddenly went out. Then another, until every hidden light beneath the water disappeared. The final chapter of the old Guardians was closing, but the story of Lewis and Clark and the secret journey that followed them through the wilderness was only beginning to become a legend. The following morning, they began the journey home. For once, nobody carried a secret map in their pocket. Nobody was being chased. Nobody was searching for a hidden door. The road ahead was simply a road. Eleanor rode beside Lewis while her father and grandfather traveled behind them. The old woman sat quietly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, watching the countryside with the peaceful expression of someone seeing freedom for the first time in many years. After several hours, they stopped beside a meadow. A small stream moved through the grass. Eleanor dismounted and walked toward the water. She took the silver pendant from her pocket. The river and star symbol caught the sunlight. Lewis joined her. "You're thinking about the chamber," she nodded, "and everything that happened there. Do you regret finding it?" Eleanor smiled. "No," she looked at him. "I only regret that it took so long." Lewis was quiet for a moment. Some journeys take years because we aren't ready for what we'll find. Eleanor smiled. You saying we weren't ready? Saying I wasn't. She laughed softly. Yes, looked across the meadow. When I first entered the wilderness, I thought exploration meant discovering places no one had ever seen. Now I understand that sometimes exploration means listening to people who were there before you. Eleanor looked at him warmly. That sounds like something my grandfather would say. I've learned something from him. She stepped closer. From me? Louis smiled. Especially from you. Wind moved gently through the grass. Neither hurried away. The long journey had brought them through danger, mystery, loss, and discovery. But this quiet moment beside the stream felt more important than any treasure they had found. Eleanor reached for his hand. I don't want another secret between us. Won't be. You promise. I promise. They stood together beneath the open sky. Behind them, their family waited. For the first time, the future felt larger than the past that evening. They camped beneath a sky filled with stars. Eleanor's grandfather opened his journal. He had been writing every night since leaving the hidden archive. Her father sat beside him. Thomas watched the fire. The old woman listened quietly. After a while, Eleanor asked, "What are you writing?" Her grandfather closed the journal. "The truth." She smiled. "Everything. Everything that should be remembered." Opened the journal again. On the first page he had written the wilderness was never empty. Beneath it were the names of people whose stories had been nearly forgotten. Eleanor recognized some of them, others were strangers, but now they had names, and names were the beginning of memory. Louis sat beside her. "What will you write?" Eleanor looked toward the fire. "Not what happened to us." "What then? What happened to everyone?" Louis smiled. "That may take a lifetime," she nodded. "Then I'll have a lifetime." Fire crackled softly. The river murmured nearby. One by one, everyone fell silent. The wilderness around them seemed peaceful. And somewhere beneath the distant mountains, the old chambers remained hidden. Their doors were closed, their treasures untouched, their stories safe. The guardians had finally learned that they did not need to own history to protect it. They only needed to remember. And as Eleanor rested beneath the quiet stars, she understood something her ancestors had spent generations trying to discover. The greatest treasure had never been waiting inside a chest. It had been waiting inside the journey itself. The people they met, the places they crossed, the hands that helped them, the love they found, and the stories they carried home. The river continued flowing through the darkness, slowly, peacefully, forever. And with the soft sound of water in the distance, Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing that some stories do not truly end. They simply become part of the people who remember them. Several months passed after their return. The world slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. People went back to their homes. The horses were sold or returned. The old maps were carefully stored, and the journals were placed in a quiet room where Eleanor could study them without interruption. But she noticed something strange. The more she read, the more she realized that the story of Lewis and Clark had never been as simple as people believed. Every river had another name. Every mountain had another story. Every trail had been walked long before their expedition arrived. And behind many of those stories were people whose names had almost vanished from memory. Eleanor began writing them down. She spent mornings reading, afternoons speaking with travelers and old families. At night she copied the stories into a large leather journal. Louis often sat nearby. Sometimes he read, sometimes he simply watched her work. One evening he placed an old map beside her. "I found something." Looked up. Another secret, perhaps. She opened the map. It showed the Missouri River as it had appeared decades earlier. But near the northern section was a small mark she had never seen. A circle. Inside it was a single letter, E. Eleanor frowned. "That wasn't in the original map." Louis nodded. "I know. Who added it?" "I don't know." She examined the ink. It was fresh, very fresh. "Someone has been here recently." Louis looked toward the door. "That's what I thought." Eleanor closed the journal. "Do you think the guardians are watching us?" "Maybe." "Should we be worried?" Louis shook his head. "Not yet." A quiet knock came from outside. They looked at each other. The door opened. A young traveler stood there. He carried a small leather bag. "I was told to bring this to Eleanor Vale." She stood. "Who sent you?" The traveler hesitated. "An old woman." "What old woman?" "She wouldn't give me her name." Eleanor accepted the bag. It was surprisingly heavy. She opened it. Inside was a collection of small wooden tablets. Each tablet carried a different symbol, the river. The star, the crescent, and several symbols she had never seen. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper. Alina opened it. Only one sentence had been written. The Guardians were never limited to one continent. She stared at the words. Lewis read them over her shoulder. What does that mean? The traveler stepped backward. I don't know. Is the woman? She told me to say one more thing. Alina looked at him. What? She said the story you found in the West is only the American chapter. The traveler turned toward the door. Where are you going? East. Why? He smiled. That is where the next chapter begins. Then he disappeared into the evening. Alina remained beside the table. The wooden tablets were still in her hands. For several moments she said nothing. Lewis looked at her. You're thinking about going. She smiled. You already know me too well, he laughed. Unfortunately. She placed the tablets beside the old map. For the first time, she understood that the journey had never truly been about reaching a final destination. There was always another river, another forgotten name, another story waiting for someone willing to listen. And perhaps that was the real legacy of Lewis and Clark. Not that they had reached the end of the wilderness, but that they had shown how a journey could continue long after the travelers themselves had stopped walking. Alina closed the journal. On its final page, she wrote a new sentence. Every ending is simply a doorway to another story. Then she looked toward the eastern horizon. The next journey had already begun. The eastern journey did not begin immediately. Alina waited. She wanted to understand the wooden tablets first. Each one carried a symbol, and each symbol appeared to represent a different guardian family. Some were familiar, others were completely unknown. Her grandfather studied them beside the fireplace. These are older than anything we found in the West. Much older, perhaps hundreds of years. Lewis picked up one of the tablets. This symbol appears on the old maps. Her father nodded. Then someone has been moving between these families for generations. Alina looked at the traveler's note again. The Guardians were never limited to one continent. What if the American network was only part of something larger? Her grandfather looked at her. That is possible. If it is, he smiled. Then your journey is far from finished. Alina laughed softly. I was afraid you'd say that. That night she returned to her room. Rain tapped gently against the window. She opened the leather journal. Inside were the stories she had collected. The hidden chambers, the Missouri, the old guardians, her grandfather, her father, Lewis, everything that had changed her life. She turned to the final page. The sentence she had written earlier remained there. Every ending is simply a doorway to another story. Below it, something had appeared. A small line of handwriting. Alina froze. She had not written it. The words were simple. Follow the river east. She immediately called Lewis. He entered the room. What happened? She showed him the page. He stared at it. When did that appear? I don't know. Her grandfather arrived moments later. He read the message. Then he became completely silent. What is it? Alina asked. He pointed toward the wooden tablets. The Eastern Guardians. They still exist. He nodded slowly. There was one family your great-great-grandmother never managed to contact. Where? Beyond the eastern rivers. Who were they? He looked toward the rain-covered window. They were called the Keepers of the Dawn. Alina frowned. Why dawn? Because they believed every forgotten story eventually returns to the light. Lewis smiled. That sounds familiar. Her grandfather nodded. It should. He reached into an old chest. From beneath several journals, he removed a faded piece of cloth. On it was a symbol. A rising sun above a river. Alina compared it with the wooden tablets. It matched. Her grandfather handed it to her. This was sent to your grandmother many years ago. Why didn't she follow it? She tried. What happened? She disappeared for 6 months. Alina's eyes widened. Then she returned without explanation. She ever say where she had been? No. Lewis looked at the symbol. Then perhaps she left something behind. Suddenly remembered the old photograph. The one showing her grandmother beside the Missouri, and the black crescent in the background. Maybe that photograph had never been about the past. Maybe it had been a clue. She searched through the old documents. After several minutes, she found a second photograph. This one showed her grandmother much later in life. She was standing beside a river, but behind her was something impossible, a stone bridge. A bridge Alina recognized from one of the wooden tablets. Her grandmother had been there, in the east. And on the back of the photograph was a single word, dawn. Alina looked at Lewis. We're going. He smiled. I knew you would. Outside, the rain continued falling softly. The road ahead was unknown, but the river was waiting. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, another forgotten story was beginning to rise. The journey east began at dawn. The sky was pale and quiet, and a thin mist rested above the river. Alina carried the wooden tablets inside her leather bag. Louis carried the old map. Her father and grandfather traveled behind them. The road followed the river for several days. Sometimes the water disappeared behind forests. Sometimes it opened into wide fields. At night they camped beside the riverbank. The journey felt different from the expedition into the west. There was less danger, more silence, more time to think. One evening, Alina sat beside the fire with Louis. "You know what I keep thinking?" "What?" "My grandmother came this way." Louis looked at the river. "And she never told anyone. Why would she hide it? Maybe she was protecting someone." Alina smiled. "That seems to be what our family does." Louis laughed. "Perhaps you should break the tradition." "Maybe I will," she looked at him. "After all, I don't want to spend my life hiding." Louis became quiet. "I don't want you to." Their eyes met. The fire crackled softly between them. For a moment the journey disappeared. There was only the river, the night, and the quiet understanding between them. Then Alina rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever wish we'd never found the first map?" Louis thought for a moment. "No, I wouldn't have found you," she smiled. Neither spoke again for a while. The river moved gently beside them. 3 days later, they reached a small village. An old woman selling flowers noticed the wooden tablet hanging from Alina's bag. She immediately stopped. "Where did you get that?" Alina looked at her. "Do you recognize it?" The woman nodded. "That symbol hasn't been seen here in 40 years. Who used it?" "The keepers of the dawn." Alina's heart quickened. "Where can we find them?" The woman pointed toward the eastern hills. "There is an old monastery beyond the forest." "Are they still there?" The woman smiled. "Some are." "Do you mean they don't call themselves guardians anymore?" "Do they call themselves?" The woman looked at Alina. "Rememberers." Louis smiled. "Of course." Woman handed Alina a small white flower. "Take this with you." "Why?" "Because they will know you are coming." Alina accepted it. That evening they entered the forest. The trees were taller here. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. As darkness approached, they saw something glowing between the trees. Lanterns, dozens of them. They followed the lights. At the end of the trail stood an ancient stone monastery. Its walls were covered with ivy. Above the entrance was the rising sun symbol. Alina stopped. "This is it." Her grandfather nodded. They approached the doorway. Before anyone could knock, the great wooden doors opened. An elderly woman stood inside. She looked at Alina, then at the white flower in her hand. Her eyes filled with tears. "Margaret's granddaughter." Alina stepped forward. "You knew my grandmother?" The woman smiled. "She was here once." "When?" "Long ago." "Why did she come?" The woman looked toward the dark monastery hall. "To ask us to protect something." Alina's heart began beating faster. "What?" The woman turned. "Her greatest secret." She began walking inside. Alina followed. The hall was filled with old paintings. At the far end stood a large wooden door. Above it was a single sentence: "What is hidden in one land may be remembered in another." The woman placed her hand on the door. "Your grandmother believed the story of the American wilderness should never belong only to America." Alina looked confused. "What did she leave here?" The woman smiled. "A letter." She opened the door. Inside was a small chamber. At its center sat an old wooden box. Alina recognized the box immediately. It was the same style as the one her grandfather had shown her years ago. She slowly approached. The woman whispered, "Your grandmother left this for you." Alina touched the lid. For the first time she wondered what secret could possibly remain after everything they had already discovered. Then she opened the box. Inside was a single letter, and beneath it, a small silver ring. Alina lifted the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandmother's. The first line read, "My dear Alina, if you are reading this, then the story has finally reached you." Alina held the letter with both hands. For several seconds she couldn't bring herself to open it. Her grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. "My dear Alina, if you are reading this, then you have followed the river farther than I ever expected. I always knew someone in our family would eventually find the truth. I only hoped that person would understand what it meant." Alina continued reading. "The guardians were never created to hide history. They were created to protect it until people were ready to hear it. But the greatest secret I carried was not inside a chamber. It was inside my heart." Alina stopped. Louis stood beside her. What does it say? She looked up. Grandmother knew this day would come. She continued, I loved your grandfather, but I also loved the life I could never tell him about. I traveled farther east than anyone in our family knew. I met the keepers of the dawn, and I learned that every guardian eventually has to choose between protecting a secret and protecting the people they love. Alina's eyes filled with tears. I chose both. That is why I left clues, not so you would spend your life searching, but so that when the time came you would understand why I made the choices I did. At the bottom of the letter was one final paragraph. Do not continue the guardian's fear. Do not hide from the world. Take the stories home, tell them honestly. Then let the next generation decide what to do with them. Alina folded the letter. The room remained silent. Her grandfather stepped closer. What did she say? Alina handed him the letter. He read it slowly. When he reached the final lines, tears appeared in his eyes. She knew. What? That I would eventually find out, smiled sadly. She always knew me better than I knew myself. Alina looked at the silver ring. What's this? The elderly keeper smiled. Your grandmother's promise. Promise. That one day the guardians would no longer need to hide. Alina slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Louis looked at her. This is the end. Alina smiled. No, she looked toward the monastery doors. This is where we stop running. They remained at the monastery for several days. The keepers showed Alina the records her grandmother had left behind. There were letters, maps, stories, names, but there was no treasure, nothing valuable enough to sell, nothing powerful enough to control, only memories. Alina finally understood. The entire journey had been designed to teach her one simple lesson. History did not belong to the person who discovered it. It belonged to everyone who lived it. Before leaving, the elderly keeper gave Alina the wooden tablets. Take these home. The guardians need a new keeper. Alina shook her head. I don't want to become another guardian. Woman smiled. Good, because the old guardians protected stories by hiding them. She placed a hand on Alina's shoulder. You will protect them by telling them. Alina looked at Louis. He smiled. I think you're ready. She laughed softly. I don't know if anyone is ever ready. Weeks later, Alina returned home. She placed the journals on a large wooden table. Her father helped organize them. Her grandfather copied the oldest record. Thomas began writing his memories. Louis worked on the maps. And Alina began writing the story, not as a secret, not as a treasure hunt, but as a history. She wrote about the wilderness, the rivers, the people who knew the land, the guardians, the families, the mistakes, the friendships, and the quiet romance that had grown between two travelers who had expected to find a mystery, but instead found each other. Years passed. The story was eventually shared. Some people believed it, others did not. Some called it a legend, others called it history. Alina never argued. She simply continued writing, because she had learned that truth did not need to shout. Sometimes it only needed to survive one quiet evening. Alina and Louis returned to the Missouri River. They were older now. The sunset painted the water gold. Alina carried the silver pendant. Louis carried the old compass. They sat beneath a tree. Do you remember our first journey? She asked. Louis smiled. I remember thinking we'd never make it home. Now he looked at her. Now I realize home was never a place. Alina smiled. Then what was it? He gently took her hand. Whoever was waiting for us. The river moved slowly before them. No hidden doors opened. No mysterious lanterns appeared. No secret maps waited beneath the water. And that was exactly how it should be. The adventure had ended. The mystery had ended. But the story remained. Because somewhere in a quiet room, another person would one day open Alina's journal. They would read about Louis and Clark. They would read about the wilderness. They would read about the forgotten guardians. And perhaps they would understand what Alina had finally learned. The greatest treasure is not what we discover. It is what we choose to remember. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The river continued its ancient journey. And beneath the peaceful evening sky, Alina closed her journal for the final time. Not because there were no more stories, but because she knew the next story belonged to someone else. Epilogue. Years passed quietly after the final journey. The old maps were placed in wooden chests. The journals were carefully preserved, and the stories of the wilderness slowly traveled from one generation to another. Alina never stopped writing. Every morning she opened her journal beside the window. Sometimes she wrote for hours. Sometimes she wrote only a few lines. She learned that not every day needed an adventure. Some days were beautiful simply because nothing happened. Rain fell softly against the roof. Birds moved through the trees, the river continued flowing, and the people she loved were still nearby. Louis often sat beside her while she worked. He rarely interrupted. He understood that some memories needed silence. One evening, Alina closed her journal and looked outside. The Missouri was glowing beneath the setting sun. "Do you ever miss the wilderness?" she asked. Louis smiled. "Every day. You go back." He thought about it. "Yes. Even after everything. Especially after everything." Alina laughed softly. "I knew you'd say that," took her hand. "I wouldn't go alone." She looked at him. "You never have to." For a long time they sat together without speaking. The river moved gently in the distance, the same river that had carried explorers, the same river that had hidden secrets, the same river that had witnessed their first journey. Now it carried only the evening light. And perhaps that was the most peaceful ending they could have hoped for. No treasure remained to be found. No enemy remained to defeat. No secret demanded another journey. The world had become quiet, and sometimes quiet was the greatest reward. Alina opened her journal one final time. On the last page she wrote, "We crossed mountains searching for answers. We followed rivers searching for treasure. We opened doors searching for the past. But in the end, the greatest discovery was much simpler. People are the stories they leave behind. Love is the journey we choose to share. And memory is the treasure that time cannot steal." She closed the journal. The room became still. Outside, the evening breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere far away, the river continued toward the horizon, slowly, patiently, forever. And as night settled over the wilderness, the old stories remained where they belonged, not locked inside forgotten chambers, but alive in the hearts of those who remembered them. The adventure of Lewis and Clark had become history. The mystery of the Guardians had become a legend. And Alina's journey had become a story passed quietly from one generation to the next. A story about wilderness, a story about courage, a story about hidden treasure, a story about love. But above all, a story about remembering. And beneath the endless American sky, the river continued to flow, quietly carrying the past into the future. And somewhere beside that river, beneath the gentle stars, two travelers who had once searched for a treasure finally found something far more precious. They found home.